If you're still awake, there's probably a reason. This is Boring History Nights, where history doesn't speak loudly, but long enough to hush the dark. You didn't come here for answers, maybe not even for sleep, maybe just to be somewhere soft. Here, the stories don't push, they float. The air doesn't move. Somewhere, a chair creaks, or maybe it's just your breath brushing the quiet. Dust lingers mid-fall, as if history paused. Whatever warmth you carried, it wouldn't have lasted the night. Let's not stretch this too fast. If something about this quiet spiral makes the night pass easier, you can subscribe, only if you'd want to hear the next one drift by. And if you're still awake, say where the night found you. I read them all, even the ones that only meant to stay a minute. Now let the dark stay dark. Let whatever follows arrive slowly, like it's always been here. You don't have to keep up. Just listen. This is Boring History Nights, and you're already inside it. They didn't scream. Not always. The Romans were many things: builders, conquerors, lawgivers, but they were also masters of silence, the kind that wraps around a punishment not to hush it, but to let it echo longer. Some of their worst acts didn't need raised voices. They needed only space, time, and the right kind of still. A paradox sits at the core of Roman justice. It was orderly, and yet unspeakable. It promised structure, a republic of laws, a hierarchy of courts, procedures carved into bronze and stone. But within that order lived something slower, something faint, something hollow. It didn't shout its cruelty. It let it seep. Rome did not need fire to burn someone down. Sometimes, it only needed a crowd that didn't look away, or a sentence carried out in an alley with no sky. The contradiction deepens. A civilization that prized honor, dignity, virtues, and yet found spectacle in pain. A society that believed punishment should be seen, not hidden, that suffering should serve a purpose if not to redeem, then to warn. There is a story told without a name, because there were so many like him, a thief, or perhaps just a slave accused of theft. The records don't preserve the reason, only that he was taken not to court, but to a gate. The crowd was thin. Midday heat had driven most away. No grand Colosseum here, no lions waiting, just a man, a post, and a hammer that didn't hurry. His hands were tied first, not for restraint, but to stretch the skin. Then the nails, quiet, deliberate, not swung like a sword, pressed like a lesson. The punishment wasn't death, it was the waiting before it. This was not rare. In fact, it was routine. Rome had a strange relationship with cruelty. It was never random, and rarely hidden. That's what made it horrifying. A brutal act in a rage feels chaotic. A punishment methodically arranged, announced, and executed. That's something else entirely. It's the difference between a scream and a whisper that goes on too long. And so much of it was designed for the still. Even the crucifixion, which would come later in our story, was not about the nails, but the slowness, the soft fade of breath, the way the condemned looked like they were being held up to the gods, but in reality were left there to be ignored. The Roman world believed that justice must be seen, not in the abstract, but in the flesh. It was a justice made of bone and breath, of skin peeled back from the body to show the muscle of empire beneath. There was no corner of life untouched by the law, from high-born senators whispering betrayal over goblets of wine, to children caught stealing figs in the market. Everyone stood somewhere in the system, and everyone could fall through it. But not all punishments were loud. Some were meant to erase. Rome knew how to undo a person. Not kill, not right away, but take their name, their status, their ability to speak. Damnatio memoriae, condemnation of memory, was one of its quietest punishments. You weren't just punished, you were erased. Statues chiseled down to blank, inscriptions scratched out with deliberate slowness. The sentence didn't end with death. It kept going, soft, faint, hollow. You begin to feel how much of Rome's punishment was about rhythm, not pain alone, but pace. The way suffering stretched, the slow ritual of binding, the procession through the streets, the long delay before the blade or the beast. It was never quick, and it was never private. There's a scroll fragment found near a Roman border town, barely legible, charcoal script on cracked plaster. It lists names: men, women, 2 children, followed by simple words for the lesson. We don't know the lesson, only that it needed bodies. Rome didn't explain itself to the punished. That wasn't the point. The point was what the rest of the room saw. Even the architecture told the story. Forums with stones placed not just for strength, but for sound. The way a sentence passed in a hall could echo to the far wall, soft and sure. The chains used in public weren't just tools. They were signals, and sometimes even symbols. Still, not all punishments required crowds. Some preferred the whisper, a quiet exile, a sudden disappearance, a soft footstep on the stairs before a man was never seen again. Rome allowed for that too, justice by vanishing, a silence that didn't announce itself. It just replaced what had been there. There's no comfort here, but that's not the point. You didn't come here for comfort, only something still, something dim. One historian once wrote that Rome punished like it built roads deliberately, efficiently, and with a destination in mind. That destination wasn't always death. Sometimes it was surrender, or fear, or memory. And sometimes the punishment wasn't what was done to the body. It was what happened after. The way your family had to carry your shame like a second cloak. The way your name changed in the mouths of others, softened, slurred, then dropped altogether. Imagine walking through a Roman alley, stone cool beneath your feet. You pass a wall. There's a mark scratched deep, a name, a date. Then silence. No one remembers who it was for, but someone carved it. Someone needed it to stay. You wonder, briefly, if punishment ends when pain does, or if it lingers, like the dust that doesn't settle, like the rope left behind. There's a rhythm to cruelty when it becomes routine. Not a rhythm you want to tap your foot to, but one that finds your breath anyway. Soft, slow, hollow. That's where we start tonight. In the quiet before the screams. In the pause between sentence and suffering. You imagine a body held up by the sky, but it wasn't lifted to honor, just to hang in hollow quiet. Crucifixion was not invented by the Romans, but they perfected it in a way only Rome could not, through innovation, but through purpose. They understood something that many civilizations overlooked, that death could be turned into a warning if you made it slow enough, public enough, and utterly still. It was less about execution, more about theater, and not the kind that ended when the curtain fell. There was nothing efficient about crucifixion. That was the point. Roman beheadings could be done in seconds, but that was mercy. And mercy was currency Rome didn't spend often, certainly not on rebels, deserters, or slaves who tried to remember they were human. Crucifixion was punishment as performance, each nail not just pain, but punctuation. The wrists came first. Always the wrists. The hands could tear too easily. They learned that quickly. The body had to hang for hours, even days. To collapse too soon was to escape the sentence, and the sentence wasn't death. It was waiting. The condemned were often forced to carry the crossbeam, the patibulum, across long streets, lined with the indifferent or the gleeful. By the time they reached the place of execution, their backs were already split from lashes, their shoulders bruised from wood. The vertical post, the stipes, waited like a silent monument. And there was no ceremony, just dirt, ropes, nails, and time. Some were tied instead of nailed. That was considered merciful, but mercy, again, was rarely free. A tied man could last 2-3 days. Their legs might be broken to hurry the end, but that too was at the whim of the executor. It all depended on who was watching and what message needed to be sent. Rebels were nailed. Thieves might be tied. A slave who struck his master could be hung upside down, a variation designed to slow suffocation, to prolong the fading of breath. You would think the worst part was the pain, and it was, in a way. The body sagged, pulling the lungs closed. Every breath became a choice. Push up with your feet often nailed to and gasp, or stay still and drown in air. But what lingers is not the gasping. It's the stillness between. The hours when no one moved, when even the crows waited. There are accounts, though fragmented, that suggest crucifixion was sometimes used in groups. Dozens hung along a road, lining it like torches of flesh and bone. Each figure a syllable in a sentence. Rome was writing with bodies. Do not resist. Do not rise. This is what forgetting your place looks like. The meanings changed depending on who read them, but the letters were always read. It's difficult to imagine now, not because it's too far, but because it's too close. A form of punishment so theatrical, so premeditated, that it functioned not just as justice, but as language. Rome spoke through the crucified. Their silence became speech. Their bodies became the grammar of fear. There is a quiet horror in knowing that some of those men, those slaves, those rebels, hung for days under the soft Roman sun, with the city going on behind them, bread baked, horses clattered across stone. Children ran past without looking up. Punishment was not hidden behind walls. It lived in the street. It waited in the corner of every forum. It loomed over gates and roads and fields. One historian called crucifixion a slow unspooling, not a moment, but a passage, not a blow, but a journey. Some who were crucified were denied burial, left for animals or rot. Others, especially in earlier times, were taken down and tossed unceremoniously into ditches. Their names vanished, their crimes forgotten, but their stillness remained. There's a faint legend, too soft to be certain, too repeated to ignore, of a woman in Campania who bribed a guard to end her lover's suffering. He had been crucified for aiding a runaway slave. She came each night, climbing the hill slowly, carrying water he could no longer drink. On the third night, he was gone. No trace, no blood, no body, just a stone on the hill, warm from the sun and faintly carved with the letter Q. Some say she moved him. Others say she broke him free. Most say the guard took the bribe, then buried the secret. Rome didn't care so long as someone suffered. Crucifixion became especially notorious under emperors like Tiberius and Nero, but it had always been there, lingering behind law and order, a quiet sentence waiting for the wrong gesture, the wrong blood, the wrong defiance. In Judea, it became common enough to breed whispers of prophecy. In Gaul, it was used to suppress rebellion. In Rome itself, it was always just close enough to see, but far enough to forget. And for all its spectacle, the method remained simple. Wood, nails, rope, a hammer, and patience. There was no invention, just intention. Rome didn't need complexity. It needed obedience. And crucifixion made obedience visible, not in the living, but in the stillness of the dead. There's a line buried in a letter from Seneca, the philosopher who tried very hard to make cruelty sound reasonable. He described crucifixion as a lesson one can see without words. He didn't mean it as irony, but time has a way of turning intent sideways. Today, it reads like an indictment. And yet not every crucified person disappeared. A few remained in story, not many. Their names were rarely carved in stone. More often, they were sketched in margins, whispered over fires, retold by the families of slaves who swore it wouldn't happen again. But Rome was always listening, and the whisper of a nail was often louder than a scream. You picture it again, the body, arms spread not in welcome, but in arrest, legs bent, head fallen, not a cross like in paintings, more like a pole or a T. the kind of shape that fades into the landscape if you don't look twice. That's how they wanted it. Part of the view, not an event, a feature. It's strange how death, in Rome, became a design element, a way to decorate a horizon, a means of filling empty space. The condemned weren't hidden away in prisons. They became shadows across roads, flesh against the fading sky, reminders that stillness wasn't always peace. Sometimes it was policy. And the worst part? The body betrayed itself. In the end, every breath became involuntary. Every twitch felt like begging. Even if the soul remained defiant, the limbs surrendered, the body folded. Rome didn't want you broken in spirit, just in posture, just enough to prove who was watching. And someone always was. That was the last mercy or the last curse. You never died alone. Even when no one cared, the silence watched you. The most horrifying punishment methods used in Rome didn't always bleed, but they always lingered. And crucifixion was the one that lingered longest, not because of how it ended, but because of how slow the ending came. When punishment became performance, the lines between justice and spectacle blurred in ways that still unsettle even the most stoic historians. Rome had a unique gift for transforming cruelty into culture, and nowhere was this more evident than in the practice of damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to beasts. It wasn't simply a punishment, it was a ritual, a choreography of death designed not only to erase the condemned, but to entertain the living. In this public theater, men and women weren't just executed, they were devoured, piece by trembling piece, while thousands watched with calm anticipation, soft murmurs, and the occasional cheer. The Colosseum, that towering bowl of limestone and echo, was not built to echo silence. Its shape carried sound, held it, twisted it. A gasp could ripple like water. A scream could bloom and wilt before reaching the outer tier. And yet, despite the grandeur of the structure, what happened within was never about the architecture. It was about what filled it: the fear, the blood, the slow chase between predator and prey that unfolded, not in wild forests, but beneath polished stone and an awning of Roman engineering. The condemned, often criminals, slaves, prisoners of war, or Christians during waves of persecution, were led into the arena with little ceremony. Some were given weapons, dull or broken, a gesture designed not for fairness but for show. Others were unarmed, dressed in theatrical costumes, mocked as mythical villains or monsters before being handed to the real ones: lions, leopards, bears, creatures caught far from Rome's walls, transported with care only until they reached the cage. The point wasn't efficiency, it was narrative. Imagine standing in the center of that arena, soft dust underfoot, thousands of eyes above you like stars turned to stone. You'd hear the gates open, the slow grind of metal, the hush that swept the audience, the growl that rose before the beast even stepped into light. It was not a quick thing. The animals were often starved beforehand. The trainers teased them, made them circle. Sometimes the kill didn't happen right away. Sometimes it took minutes of pacing, of near contact, of soft-footed hesitation before teeth met flesh. And even then, it was rarely clean. There was no script, just instinct. The most unsettling aspect wasn't the violence itself, it was the pacing. Rome understood that fear grows best when it is stretched, that the slow advance of claws, the careful approach of a lion whose ribs showed through its skin, could hold an audience longer than any speech. The condemned, in turn, became actors in a play they never auditioned for. Each movement, each flinch, was a line. Each drop of blood, a cue. And the audience, they weren't passive. They were participants. They booed the hesitant, cheered the defiant, threw bits of bread, laughed when a man stumbled over his own shadow. Children sat beside their parents, watching death arrive like a guest who always knew the way in. Some historians argue this wasn't cruelty, but culture, that the games were tradition, a form of civic pride, a celebration of imperial dominance. But others, the ones who listen more to the quiet than the noise, suggest something else, that Rome used the arena not to display strength, but to practice numbness, that by watching enough suffering, you eventually stopped seeing it. The beasts, too, suffered. Many didn't survive the event. If the condemned somehow killed one, a rare but not unheard of act, the audience would erupt, not in horror, but in excitement. A brief reversal of roles was always good for the drama, but the next wave would come. There were always more animals, always more people. Rome's reach ensured both. There is a surviving inscription near Capua that lists several notable executions held during a provincial governor's festival. Among them is a child, likely 13, who was dressed as Icarus before being released into the arena with a bear. No wings, no sky, just metaphor. This wasn't an exception. It was a design. And still, some tried to speak during their final moments. Christian accounts, though often embroidered by later retellings, describe men singing hymns, or women praying aloud as the animals approached. The Romans didn't silence them. In fact, they welcomed it. A voice raised in faith, then cut short by fangs, made for excellent symbolism. It proved the empire's might, the gods' superiority, the order of things. That slow, hollow quiet after the final cry was Rome's favorite punctuation. The logistics were vast. The underground levels of the Colosseum, the hypogeum, were a system of cages, pulleys, and platforms. Animals and people rose through trapdoors, emerging from the earth like myths made flesh. Some engineers spent their lives refining those mechanisms, ensuring the timing matched the crowd's rhythm. There were cues, drums, signals to keep everything moving without becoming rushed. Punishment in Rome didn't stumble, it flowed. One account describes a performer condemned to death, who was set on fire and sent running across the arena as part of a reenactment of Hercules' death. The crowd loved it. He tripped once. The flames caught more quickly than expected, but no one intervened. That wasn't the point. Mercy disrupts the script. You wonder if anyone in those crowds ever turned their head, looked away, found the light too dim or the air too still, maybe. But even that was a kind of participation. Rome didn't need belief. It needed bodies in seats. The phrase Damnatio ad Bestias sounds almost elegant in Latin, condemnation to the beasts. But in practice, it was the act of feeding flesh to myth, a way to take someone who had defied, failed, or merely annoyed the machine, and reduce them to noise and memory. And sometimes not even that. Some were unnamed. Some were forgotten before the blood dried. But the echo, the faint echo of the crowd, the soft growl, the slow unraveling of self that stayed. A few voices have slipped through, not many, and not clearly, but fragments. In one surviving letter, a Roman guard writes of a woman who stood still as the gate opened. She did not run. She did not scream. She whispered something the guard couldn't hear, but he swore she smiled. Whether this is truth or a trick of memory, no one knows, but the image endures. You begin to feel the shape of Rome's justice. It wasn't precise, but it was patient. It didn't need every punishment to succeed, only enough to be seen, enough to make others walk a little slower, breathe a little shallower, follow a little softer. And when the last roar faded, when the sand had been raked clean, and the crowd spilled out into streets, still warm from the sun, the story didn't end, it lingered. In the wine shared that evening, in the sleep of children who dreamed not of monsters, but of cheers, in the hollow pause before the next festival. The most horrifying punishment methods used in Rome weren't always administered by judges. Sometimes they were fed, sometimes they were applauded, sometimes they were simply expected. If your eyes are fading, let them. The story wasn't waiting for anyone. Inside a sealed skin of fate, a man drowned not alone, but with beasts who never asked to be part of the sentence. Poena culae was one of Rome's more bizarre and deeply symbolic punishments, a method that blurred the line between justice, ritual, and fear, as if the strangeness of the act itself was meant to amplify its weight. This was not a punishment reserved for soldiers or enemies of the state. This was for parricides, those who killed their own father, mother, or close kin. In Rome, this was not simply a crime. It was an act that ripped at the very logic of the world, a violation so profound that the punishment had to feel equally unnatural. The sentence was not just death. It was deliberate erasure through absurdity, a return to chaos, sealed in leather and silence. Once convicted, the parricide was sewn into a large sack, the culleus, along with a strange collection of animals, typically a dog, a monkey, a snake, and a rooster. The combination was more than theatrical. Each creature symbolized something: chaos, betrayal, noise, deception. Although historians continue to debate their exact meanings, what they shared was an inability to be controlled once confined, their frantic instincts echoing the social rupture the crime represented. The sack itself was more than a container. It was a message. It wasn't just meant to carry the body, it was designed to destroy it without ceremony. Once sealed inside, the bundle was tossed into a river, often the Tiber, and left to vanish beneath the current. No burial, no monument, no ash returned to the family. The crime of killing one's parent demanded more than death. It demanded disappearance. In a culture so rooted in family legacy, ancestry, and the naming of generations, to kill one's own blood was to break the chain of memory, and the punishment answered with silence, a silence sewn shut. Imagine the experience. Not only the dread of drowning, but the wild unpredictability inside the sack. The monkey's claws, the dog's panic, the rooster's flailing wings, the snake silent, impossible to see in the dark. The confined space would become a storm of instinct, each creature reacting not to the crime, but to their own fear. In those last minutes, the condemned did not die alone, but neither did he die among peers. He died inside a symbol, as chaos tried to consume itself. Some scholars believe that the ritual was designed to mirror cosmic disorder, that the unnaturalness of the crime needed to be answered by an equally unearthly scene. Others argue that it was rooted in older, perhaps Etruscan traditions, lost to time but still pulsing under Roman law like a quiet echo. Regardless, the method persisted across centuries, sometimes falling out of fashion, only to reappear when a crime disturbed the public so deeply that ordinary execution felt inadequate. There are records scattered, difficult to trust, that describe certain executions where the animals escaped, or worse, where the sack tore mid-process and floated open, revealing a tangle of limbs and feathers. The image is grotesque, yes, but more than that, it is surreal. Rome didn't hide from these moments. If anything, it cataloged them. The absurdity was part of the fear, a warning that the world only stays ordered if people stay in their place. Kill your father, and even nature will turn against you. Occasionally, the punishment was altered. If no animals could be found, the man might be sewn in alone. Some were beaten first, others were gagged or blinded, but the core ritual remained: no blood spilled, no final words, no stage, just a bag, a river, and the slow hush of water swallowing what society could not forgive. There is something distinctly Roman in the theatricality of it all, not just in the act itself, but in its setting. The procession to the river was sometimes public. Citizens would line the banks, watching not with cruelty, but with a strange reverence. This was not an ordinary criminal. This was a breaker of bonds, a destroyer of the household gods, and as such, his departure had to feel permanent. It had to unsettle. Even the river played a role. The Tiber, with its slow, silted flow and its faint smell of rot, became a place of quiet endings. Rome dumped many things into its bodies, garbage, offerings, but the Cullius was different. It was not thrown in haste. It was placed, as though the river, not the state, were delivering the final judgment. There's a softness to water that makes this punishment all the more haunting. A blade is definitive. A fire consumes, but water drowns slowly, without edges, wrapping itself around the body like a second skin. One surviving legal text describes the punishment with unnerving calm. It lists the crimes, the conditions, the animals, almost casually, and then it ends with the phrase, et aqua finis erit, and water will be the end. Not a metaphor, just a fact. Yet the poetry of it lingers. The water is the end, not the sack, not the sentence, not the scream, as if nature itself were asked to finish what Rome began. There's an echo of this punishment in stories whispered by later Christian writers, martyrs, who spoke of those unjustly sentenced this way. Whether those stories are rooted in fact or in fear, they all share one thing, the image of a man fading not in flames or blood, but in motionless water, surrounded by animals who never chose to be part of his ending. It's difficult to know how often this was carried out. Some historians argue it was rare, more symbolic than practical. Others suggest it was more common than records reveal, its bizarre nature making it less likely to be remembered clearly or recounted honestly. Either way, it remains one of the clearest windows into the Roman mind, not because of its violence, but because of its precision. Every element had meaning. Every detail served the narrative, even the silence after the splash. The punishment wasn't just about deterrence. It was about separation. Rome could not allow such a crime to leave a trace. The man, the animals, even the sack, all were meant to vanish together, into a place that didn't echo. No grave, no stone, just the faint suggestion that something terrible had been removed from the world, and that maybe, just maybe, order had been restored. If the crucifixion displayed the empire's power, and Damnatio ad Bestias entertained its public, then Poena Culae whispered a quieter truth that some crimes were not punished to teach, but to forget. That some acts didn't deserve memory-only removal, and that the softest punishments, the ones without noise, were often the ones designed to last the longest in the dark corners of thought. You picture the sack, heavy with breath and movement, sinking slowly. The river doesn't churn. The crowd disperses. The law moves on. But somewhere, beneath the surface, the sentence is still folding into itself, faint, slow, and unrepeatable. Sometimes, Rome dressed you in flames, a garment that didn't forgive hesitation. Of all its methods of execution, burning alive may seem, at first glance, among the most primal, the most base. Fire, after all, belongs to the most ancient lexicons of punishment. But when Rome employed it, fire became more than destruction. It became theater, ritual, and even theology. Flames were not merely a way to kill. They were a way to declare that someone no longer belonged among the living, that their removal needed not just to be witnessed, but transformed into something symbolic. This form of punishment was not as common as crucifixion or beheading, but it carried specific and deliberate meaning when used. Burning was often reserved for crimes that were considered fundamentally contaminating actions that disrupted not just law, but sanctity, arson, treason, religious transgression, or magical conspiracy could summon the flames. The very act of setting something ablaze, a temple, a granary, a home, was seen as a violence not only against people, but against the order of Rome itself. To return that crime with fire was to complete the circle, to make punishment reflect the nature of the act. There was even a term for it, tunica molesta, the annoying tunic, though that translation barely scratches the surface of its terror. It was a garment soaked in pitch, resin, and other flammable materials, then wrapped around the condemned's body like a shroud. The name's dark irony lies in its understatement. This wasn't merely bothersome, it was fatal by design. Once lit, the tunic didn't simply burn, it clung, fused, and devoured. It transformed the person into a moving pyre, an upright flame that screamed as it stumbled, each step feeding oxygen to the blaze. Accounts describe executions where the condemned were made to wear the tunica molesta during public games or festivals. These were not private. Efficient executions meant to remove a problem swiftly. These were exhibitions. The fire was timed to coincide with the crowd's mood, with the turn of the afternoon light, with the hush that fell just before ignition. Some victims were chained to stakes. Others were left mobile, allowed to stagger until they collapsed in ash and ember. The fire was slow enough to allow recognition. That, after all, was the point. The people had to see who burned. You may wonder how this could be watched, how citizens, senators, even children could witness such agony without turning away. But Rome conditioned its people to see punishment as necessary spectacle. The line between sacred fire and punishing flame was thin. Fires were central to Roman religious rituals. The Vestal virgins tended eternal flames. The hearth, the focus, was the spiritual center of every home. Fire was purity. Fire was renewal. When Rome burned someone, it was not just to destroy, but to cleanse, to excise the impure, so the body politic could remain whole. One infamous use of the tunica molesta occurred during the reign of Nero. After the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE, suspected arsonists, often scapegoated Christians, were dressed in the flammable tunics and set alight at night to provide illumination for the emperor's private gardens. The horror of this detail has echoed for centuries, people reduced to torches. Their last moments spent not in darkness, but as unwilling instruments of spectacle. Tacitus, one of the few Roman historians who allowed pity into his prose, recorded that while the public distrusted Christians, they pitied the cruelty of their deaths. Even in Rome, sympathy sometimes flickered where no justice remained. It's important to understand that these executions were not chaotic events. They were structured, rehearsed, even refined. The flammable materials had to be prepared days in advance. The execution site cleared and arranged. The spectators managed. The flames choreographed. This was death as design. There is something uniquely chilling about the idea of human combustion being scheduled, anticipated, applauded, not as horror, but as part of the civic rhythm. In some rare cases, burning was done as a posthumous act, the body set alight not to kill, but to dishonor. A traitor's corpse might be cremated outside the city walls, forbidden burial rites, their ashes scattered or discarded. This too was punishment. For Rome believed in the afterlife not only through religion, but through memory. To be denied proper rites was to be denied rest. Fire, in this sense, didn't just end life, it interrupted legacy. There are inscriptions that survive, etched in stone, which suggest that burning alive was used as a warning against theft of sacred property. A temple defiled, a priesthood dishonored. Such acts were seen as affronts not only to the gods, but to the state's stability. The fire answered with finality. The body became a cautionary tale of flame-shaped absence. One fragment, preserved only in part, tells of a woman accused of witchcraft. Her accuser, a jealous rival who feared her knowledge more than her intent. The court could not prove her guilt, but the rumor proved enough. She was paraded in the forum, her tunic soaked and dragging behind her like a second shadow. When it caught, she didn't run. The onlookers noted this. She stood until the flames curled up her arms. Whether this was dignity or defeat, no one could say, but the image remained. Rome never truly feared fire, not in the way modern cities might. It was a constant companion, both in worship and in destruction. Buildings burned frequently. Temples collapsed into coals. Yet the idea of using fire against a person deliberately slowly marked a threshold between the living and something else. Fire removed detail, Faces melted, bones blackened, identity dissolved. In a city obsessed with names, ancestry, honorifics, and legacy, fire obliterated all of it in minutes. And that was precisely why it was used. There was no need to carve your name in a blacklist if your face no longer existed. Still, not all uses of fire were equal. A senator might be given a clean blade, a general might be exiled or poisoned. But a slave, a foreigner, a heretic, these could be wrapped in fire. It wasn't just about guilt, it was about status. Rome's flames did not burn equally. You imagine the crowd gathered beneath an overcast sky, their cloaks drawn, eyes squinting not from sun but from smoke. The executioner holds a torch that crackles softly in the quiet. The condemned, bound but standing, breathes slowly, knowing that every breath now is a countdown. There is no speech, no final plea, just the soft whisper of flame meeting pitch-soaked cloth. And then the tunic ignites not with a roar, but a sound more like exhaling. A faint hush, a slow bloom of heat and light that paints the body in movement until all that remains is heat and outline. Perhaps the worst part is that the fire doesn't announce itself loudly. It consumes with grace. It trails up the limbs like a lover, curls into the hair, folds itself around the torso. Only when it reaches the face does the crowd avert its gaze, but not for long. Rome had taught them to look again. And so the most horrifying punishment methods used in Rome weren't always about the sharpness of pain, but about the slow transformation of a body into symbol. The tunica molesta was more than execution. It was erasure through ritual, silence by flame. It made the condemned into an example no one could forget, not because of what they had done, but because of how completely they were made to disappear. Obedience in Rome was not merely expected. It was constructed, layer by layer, through tradition, ideology, and, when necessary, the quiet machinery of fear. Nowhere was that mechanism more deliberately refined than in the Roman military, where discipline was considered not just a virtue but a survival tactic. In this space of order and uniformity, the punishments took on a particular quality, not chaotic or excessive, but mathematically precise. Among them, one stands out for its cold, calculated cruelty, decimation. To modern ears, the word sounds like exaggeration, as though it merely suggests something being ruined or diminished. But in the Roman context, Decimatio meant exactly what it sounded like to take 1 in 10. The procedure was simple, the implications vast. If a military unit displayed cowardice, mutiny, or severe disobedience, the punishment was not directed at a single guilty party, but at the group as a whole. And so, they would be divided into groups of 10, and in each, one man selected by lot, or sometimes chosen by comrades, would be killed by the other 9. It was a ritual that combined humiliation, randomness, and complicity, leaving no one untouched. The method of execution varied. Often, the condemned were beaten to death with clubs or stones, sometimes stabbed. But the brutality of the moment was not the only weapon. The deeper cut came from the ceremony. It was done in full view of the rest of the legion, sometimes in the dead of night, sometimes at dawn. It sent a message that ran deeper than any verbal reprimand. Your survival depends on your unity, and your failure will be paid not with forgiveness, but with blood drawn by your own hands. It's difficult to fully comprehend the psychological effect of such a system. Imagine standing in a line, knowing the dice of discipline might fall on you, not because you betrayed anyone, but because the unit as a whole did. That the man who might be asked to kill you was the same one who shared his water with you the day before. The randomness made it impossible to rationalize or resist. There was no appeal, no escape. The sentence arrived wrapped in inevitability. Roman historians, such as Livy and Suetonius, document several notable instances of decimation. In one of the most cited cases under Crassus during the Spartacus revolt, cowardly behavior among the ranks led to harsh reprisals. Crassus did not hesitate. He enforced the punishment, and the resulting discipline is said to have steadied the line for months afterward. Whether the punishment was effective or merely traumatizing remains debated. But in Roman logic, the distinction was immaterial. What mattered was that the army moved as one again. There is something uniquely Roman in how the process combined formality with intimacy. Death wasn't dealt by an unseen executioner or a distant authority figure. It came from those closest to you, with hands that trembled or didn't. It broke the comfort of anonymity. A legionnaire wasn't just punished, he was made into an instrument of punishment for his brothers. And those who survived didn't escape unscathed. The knowledge that they had lived because another had died, and that they had helped lingered long after the blood dried. Some scholars suggest that decimation was rarely used, precisely because of its disruptive psychological consequences. It was a last resort, not a routine protocol. But others argue that its very scarcity made it more powerful. The threat of decimation haunted the imagination more vividly than its enactment. The fear of drawing the lot of looking into the eyes of a fellow soldier and knowing what must come next did more to enforce loyalty than any speech or oath. What makes this punishment particularly horrifying is not its body count, which in most cases was statistically limited, but its intent. Rome knew how to wield terror with precision. It didn't want chaos. It wanted order carved into the psyche. The punishment did not aim to extinguish rebellion through overwhelming force. It aimed to extinguish the possibility of rebellion by making the price of disobedience feel personal, close, and deeply unsettling. The moral implications are still debated. Some modern historians have argued that decimation was barbaric, a practice unworthy of Rome's sophisticated military system. Others see it as an unfortunate necessity within the brutal context of ancient warfare. But what is often overlooked is how the punishment blurred the line between guilt and innocence. In a decimation, no one could be clean. The condemned and the executioners were victims of the same system, caught in a machine that ran not on justice, but on deterrence. Imagine the camp afterward. The silence. The soldiers returning to their tents, hands sticky with blood, unsure whether to pray, sleep, or vomit. The commanders rarely offered words of comfort. There was no aftermath ritual, no healing, just a return to formation, just a march the next day, boots against stone, dust in the air, and eyes that didn't meet. Decimation also served a symbolic function beyond the military. It reminded Roman citizens that no one, not even their vaunted army, was above the law of order, that even in the tightest units, trust could be severed in an instant if discipline faltered. The punishment reached beyond the battlefield and seeped into the cultural consciousness. It became a metaphor for the fragility of control. In a broader sense, it reveals how Rome perceived the value of life. The individual mattered only as a cog in the larger structure. If 10 lives could remind 1,000 to stand firm, then the math was justified. The Romans did not pretend otherwise. Their ethics were not shaped by mercy, but by consequence. To be Roman was to understand that survival was conditional. And yet, even within this system, there were cracks. Letters and personal accounts few, but haunting hint at the emotional toll. One fragment from a soldier stationed in Gaul speaks of a decimation ordered during a harsh winter. The man writes of snowflakes landing on the cheeks of the condemned as they stood, waiting for the sentence to begin. He describes how one soldier dropped his club midway through and had to be forced to pick it up again. The horror was not in the act, but in the hesitation, the small moment when humanity tried to surface before being crushed back down. In rare cases, soldiers refused to carry out the sentence, risking death themselves. When this happened, the punishment escalated, sweeping up entire units into harsher forms of execution or exile. Rome could tolerate many things, but the refusal to obey, especially within the ranks, was not one of them. the gears had to keep turning, even if they were greased with the faint sound of breath catching in the throat. The most horrifying punishment methods used in Rome, especially within the military, did not need spectacle. They didn't need flames or beasts. They needed only a formula 1 in 10, and the rest would follow. The genius of Rome's cruelty lay in its simplicity. It did not scream, it whispered. It laid out its logic with calm hands and trusted that fear would do the rest. In the end, decimation wasn't about removing the weakest. It was about reminding everyone that strength was meaningless without obedience, that unity wasn't a bond. It was a chain, and that sometimes the softest links, the ones that looked the most stable, were the first to break when the hammer fell. Thrown not for murder, but for betrayal. The fall wasn't long, but the silence afterward always was. The Tarpeian Rock, that narrow ledge on the southern face of Rome's Capitoline Hill, offered no grandeur, no ceremony, and no prolonged torment. Yet in its brutal simplicity, it held a singular place in Roman punishment, a sentence that traded fire and steel for gravity, anonymity, and the quiet finality of impact. The condemned did not burn, bleed, or suffocate. They fell, and in falling, they vanished from the city's living memory in the most literal and irrevocable way. The Tarpeian Rock was not hidden in some distant corner of the empire. It was within the very heart of Rome, just behind the temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus. This proximity to the divine was no accident. To fall from the cliff was not merely a death. It was a fall from grace, a symbolic and physical ejection from the city's sacred core. Those condemned to the rock were typically traitors individuals who had betrayed the Republic or, later, the empire in ways deemed unforgivable. Their punishment was not meant to correct, but to erase, to remove not just the body, but the trust that body had once represented. Tarpeia herself, the mythical figure after whom the cliff was named, offered Rome its earliest legend of betrayal. As the story goes, she was a Vestal virgin who opened the gates to the Sabines, either for gold or out of misplaced affection, and was crushed to death beneath their shields. Whether she was a traitor or a misunderstood scapegoat is still debated, but the rock that bears her name, absorbed the moral of the tale betrayal, is punished by weight, by collapse, by a sudden absence that leaves no room for mourning. The execution was often sudden, without flourish. The condemned was bound, sometimes gagged, and escorted up the Capitoline Hill. No trial was held in public. No final words were given to the crowd. This was not a death meant to entertain or educate. It was a procedure, meant to mark a boundary, the outermost edge of citizenship, of acceptability, of belonging. One step beyond that edge, and the body became something else, no longer Roman, no longer worthy of rites or remembrance. Some versions of the practice describe the victim being flung backward, their head the first to strike the rock face. Others suggest they were pushed face forward, the moment of descent intended to preserve the look of recognition, to let them see the city they were leaving as it turned its back. The fall was roughly 25 meters, not enough to guarantee instant death. There are accounts, rare and poorly detailed, of those who survived the initial impact, only to be finished by guards below, or left to die alone among stones and silence. The cruelty was not in the descent, but in the refusal to see what came after. To die by the Tarpeian Rock was to lose your name in a city obsessed with lineage. It stripped identity without spectacle. Families of the condemned were often barred from retrieving the body. No urn, no inscription, no lament. In a culture where even the humblest citizen might expect a marker, a line of text, a stylized bust, a handful of coins, the absence of memory was a second death, just as permanent as the first. And yet, there's something quietly theatrical in the ritual's restraint, in the way it used place instead of tool. The rock did not change over centuries. It did not rust like a blade or burn out like a pyre. It simply waited, Always the same stone, always the same drop. A reminder that justice in Rome, while often embellished, sometimes preferred silence. There's a cruelty to that minimalism, a sense that what mattered wasn't how you died, but that no one would speak of it afterward. For those who passed the site in peacetime, the rock must have seemed unremarkable, just another cliff in a city of elevation and edge. But to those who understood, it whispered differently. It whispered of men who had once stood in senatorial robes, who had cast votes, led troops, given speeches, and who had eventually been deemed unworthy of the trust they were once given. The rock collected those stories without judgment. It did not differentiate between the ambitious and the desperate, between the truly guilty and those caught in the shifting tides of politics. There is a peculiar quiet that follows betrayal, a stillness that overtakes the names not shouted, the stories not retold. In Rome, that stillness had a home, a ledge, barely wide enough to stand upon, but expansive enough to carry the weight of centuries. Even the location was symbolic, so close to the temples, yet so final in its sentence. To walk past it was to feel, however faintly, the echo of footsteps that never returned. Over time, the practice fell out of common use, replaced by more centralized and uniform methods of execution, as the empire expanded and bureaucracy took firmer hold. But the legend endured. The cliff, though less frequented, remained a part of Rome's psychological landscape, a stone boundary between law and its failure, between honor and its collapse. Some later writers romanticized the fall, imagining poetic last moments or secret prayers offered to Jupiter as the condemned stared skyward. But the truth is likely far simpler. There would have been no time for poetry, just the cold stone beneath sandals, the grip of soldiers on your arms, the sudden tilt of the world as your body left it. No grand farewell, no soft metaphor, just a sudden stop. Still, not every man who stood at the edge was resigned. There are fragments, half-sentences in personal letters, margin notes in law scrolls that suggest some pleaded, others cursed, a few laughed. There's no record of whether any were pardoned at the last moment, no clear tale of a reprieve. In this form of execution, the fall was both sentence and act. Once the path to the top was taken, it rarely turned back. And yet, you might wonder what makes this punishment linger, despite its simplicity. Perhaps it is because it relied so little on method and so much on meaning. The Tarpeian Rock was not a device, it was a decision, a societal consensus that someone no longer deserved footing in the world they had once helped shape, that their final act, whether cowardice, treachery, or dissent, removed their right to stand among the living. The rock, in its unmoving patience, delivered that conclusion without ceremony, without drama, only with certainty. There's an unease that comes from knowing a person can fall, not because of what they did, but because of who no longer protected them. Roman politics was full of sharp turns and sudden downfalls. One day a man might be hailed as a hero, the next, his name could be spoken only in whispers, if at all. The rock didn't care about the shifts. It simply remained where it was, collecting those too dangerous to forgive. The most horrifying punishment methods used in Rome did not always draw blood across an arena floor or burn through cloth soaked in pitch. Sometimes, they simply removed a person from the story cleanly, finally, and without echo. That kind of silence carries a different weight. It presses slowly against the past, until only the shape of the absence remains. If none of this is making sense anymore, you're exactly where you should be. Their backs turned red, not because they lied, but because someone higher up whispered they did. In the long, disciplined spine of Roman authority, there was no punishment more intimately applied than scourging and flaying. These were punishments that did not aim for immediate death, nor did they seek the total erasure of a person. Instead, They worked deliberately on the threshold of survival, crafting pain as testimony, marking the skin so that the body itself became the record. It was not a performance for the masses like the arena, nor a philosophical severing like Decimation. This was something else, private, precise, and profoundly intimate. The flagrum, or Roman scourge, was no simple whip. It was often composed of several leather thongs, each weighted at the ends with pieces of bone or metal, sometimes hooks. These additions didn't just tear skin, they were designed to dig, catch, and pull. The purpose was never just to hurt, it was to open. A man whipped with a flagrum was not merely punished, he was rewritten, his flesh transformed into a map of his disobedience. In some cases, the victim was flogged until the bone showed. In others, until they passed out from the sheer volume of nerve endings overloaded with pain. If death came, it was almost always accidental but rarely regretted. In theory, Roman citizens were protected from scourging. In practice, the line was porous. The law might prohibit it for those with rank, but accusations, political shifts, or simple bad luck could strip a man of his protections faster than parchment could record it. Slaves, however, had no such illusions. Their backs were canvases on which Roman discipline painted its message again and again. A slave could be flogged for theft, for insolence, for speaking out of turn, or simply for being present during another's failure. There's a quiet terror in knowing that the pain was meant to be instructional, not for the victim they already understood, but for those nearby. The crack of the whip was meant to linger in the air, to shape silence into obedience. It said more than any speech that the human body was not inviolate, that flesh could be negotiated, that identity was elastic under Roman control. Flaying, though less common, added another layer to the horror. While scourging peeled the body in slices, flaying removed it entirely, or at least, that was the intent. This punishment was reserved for particularly severe crimes: betrayal, sacrilege, acts deemed subversive to the empire itself. The victim was often strapped upright, arms extended or overhead, while executioners began at the limbs and worked inward. There was no rush. Precision was the point. In some cases, the skin was removed intact enough to be displayed, stretched across walls, draped over posts, shown as a symbol of what Rome could do when it wanted to deliver more than death. Historical evidence for routine flaying is sparse, but it lingers in enough scattered references and symbolic retellings to suggest it was used selectively, more as a mythologized warning than a frequent reality. Whether or not it happened often, the possibility of it, the very idea, was enough to control behavior, and perhaps that was the real punishment. To fear something worse than pain, to live with the thought that skin, so basic and taken for granted, could be revoked. There's a recorded account of a centurion in Britannia who ordered his men to flog a local chieftain for refusing to provide tribute. The flogging lasted so long that the man fell into a coma. When questioned later by a Roman investigator, the centurion responded that the punishment was long because the lesson was difficult. The phrase was repeated in training manuals for years afterward, not because it justified the cruelty, but because it captured the Roman mindset. Punishment was pedagogy. Pain was curriculum. It's worth noting that many executions were preceded by scourging. The flogging wasn't the main event, it was the preparation, the loosening of the spirit before the final blow. In crucifixions, the scourging served to weaken the body, to start the bleeding early, to ensure the condemned would suffer maximally while still surviving long enough to be displayed. It was a prelude, like the tuning of instruments before a concert no one wanted to attend. And yet, in some cases, the scourging was the punishment itself. Public lashing as a standalone sentence was common, especially for slaves and low-level criminals. The condemned were tied to a post in the forum, their arms raised to stretch the back taut, while the lash fell again and again in rhythms that didn't need counting. There was no maximum number of strokes, no minimum either. It depended on the mood of the executioner, the severity of the perceived insult, and sometimes the weather. Blood dried differently under a hot sun than it did in the shade, and the stains on the stone floor beneath those posts often told a longer story than the laws they were enforcing. Rome's relationship with the body was paradoxical. It admired strength, honored beauty, and immortalized its emperors in marble likenesses, yet it also delighted in the body's undoing. The same society that built aqueducts to bathe its citizens in cleanliness could also strip a man's back raw in a matter of minutes. The contradiction wasn't seen as a flaw, but as balance. Rome embraced duality, civilization on one side, savagery on the other, both flowing through the same veins. You can almost hear it, the steady rhythm of leather striking flesh, the muffled groan of someone trying not to scream, the collective breath of onlookers caught between horror and indifference. These were not private events. They took place in markets, in courtyards, on temple steps. Pain was meant to be seen. It functioned as a punctuation mark in public life, a comma in the rhythm of the day. People paused to watch, not out of bloodlust, necessarily, but because the spectacle reminded them of their place, and how fragile that place was. Occasionally, the punishment backfired. A particularly brutal flogging might provoke unrest, especially if the condemned was seen as a folk hero or martyr, but such reactions were rare and short-lived. Rome knew how to follow cruelty with distraction, a grain distribution, a play, a military parade. The lash might mark the body, but bread soothed the soul. The balance remained. One of the most poignant reflections on Roman scourging comes not from a Roman source, but from a visiting Greek scholar who described it as a sound the city wears like a bell, constant, distant, always returning. The metaphor speaks to the way pain became woven into the very atmosphere of Roman life. It was not an aberration. It was the background noise of order. And what of those who administered the punishment? Executioners, lictors, and soldiers developed a detachment that allowed them to deliver pain with the same professionalism as a scribe drafting a contract. Some grew cruel, others mechanical, but all understood their role. They were not torturers. They were instruments of structure, as essential as bricks or laws. Rome did not punish for pleasure, it punished for permanence. In rare cases, victims of scourging survived and were released, their backs a testimony of state logic. These men, especially slaves who had been spared, often wore their scars with a complicated pride. They were proof of endurance, yes, but also a reminder of ownership. The lines across their flesh became a second language, one that could not be translated but could always be read. The most horrifying punishment methods used in Rome weren't always fatal. Sometimes they were slow scripts written into skin, lines of red, where laws met bodies, where guilt and innocence blurred into the same rhythm of the lash. These punishments asked no questions. They made no claims to wisdom. They only marked what the empire demanded and left the body to remember what the mind could not forget. There's no need to rush. Not everything was meant to be remembered all at once. Some were buried in rooms that forgot to end, fed only by the sound of their own soft breathing. If there was one form of Roman punishment that refused to spill blood or ignite flame, yet carried a weight perhaps heavier than any wound, it was isolation, the slow, deliberate stripping of human contact, sound, and light. Starvation and confinement were tools used. When Rome wanted to extract something deeper than obedience, it wanted disappearance. It wanted silence. While the spectacle of crucifixion or the choreography of the arena demanded an audience, these punishments were designed for absence. The condemned were not paraded, nor made examples of in a crowd. Instead, they were placed into cells beneath forums, into vaults beneath temples, into forgotten corners of civic architecture where the walls could hold a breath longer than any crowd ever could. In these spaces, The punishment did not arrive all at once. It drifted in, slowly, like a fog wrapping around thought. Solitary confinement was often used for those awaiting trial or execution, especially in cases where the accused were seen as politically sensitive, or when public execution might provoke unrest. But there were also times when isolation was the sentence. A quiet, extended vanishing. Food would be reduced daily. Water might come irregularly. Some were given none at all. Their cell might not be entirely closed. Some had slits to let in narrow fingers of light, or to let voices echo just enough to torment, but the effect was the same, time stretched without end. Memory bent, and the body began to eat itself. Unlike the violent punishments that engraved fear onto Rome's public consciousness, these quiet punishments engraved nothing. They left no scar, no fire-blackened bone, no stone to lean flowers against. Only those who emerged, and few ever did, could describe what it meant to be erased without dying. And even then, they often lacked the words. The Mamertine prison, located beneath the Capitoline Hill, was infamous for such disappearances. Originally constructed as a cistern, its dark, circular lower chamber became a space for high-value prisoners. Its design was not accidental, a stone pit accessed by a small opening from above, difficult to descend into, nearly impossible to climb out. Light came only from the entrance. Air moved poorly. Voices echoed back strangely, so that a whisper spoken toward the wall might return sounding like someone else. There was no fire, no lash, no crowd, just the stillness of a room that never changed. It was here that Jugurtha, the captured king of Numidia, spent his final days after being paraded in a triumph. And it was here, too, that some early Christian martyrs, Peter, Paul, and others, were allegedly confined before their execution. The symbolism was not lost on the Romans. To remove a person from the world without spectacle was not an act of mercy. It was a statement that some lives no longer belonged in history, only in architecture. Starvation played its part not as an error, but as method. Denial of food was often gradual, a slow reduction of rations until the body could no longer support its own functions. In many cases, the condemned were kept just above the edge of death, weakened to the point of hallucination, their thoughts slipping between fevered memories and the rhythm of dripping water they could not reach. The point was not only to kill, but to allow the condemned to feel the slow unraveling of self, to feel the body become both tomb and prisoner. There is a letter from a Roman jailer, preserved only in fragments, describing how some prisoners would begin to speak to themselves after just a few days, not with fear, but with calm repetition. They would recite names, phrases, legal oaths as if to remind themselves they still existed. Some scratched marks into the walls, counting days, then weeks, then giving up entirely. Others carved prayers, curses, or lists of food they remembered from childhood. The mind, when placed in darkness, does not shut down, it wanders. Occasionally, these punishments were used not for justice, but convenience. A senator under suspicion, a general whose loyalty had wavered, a priest caught in the wrong moment. These individuals could be removed from the public eye without formal execution. A quiet cell, a distant outpost, a locked villa under protective guard. Their bodies were not broken, but their lives were bent into shapes no longer recognizable. Rome believed in control more than finality. If a man could be silenced without blood, that silence was often considered more elegant. One of the most haunting aspects of Roman solitary punishment is how it blurred into exile. For the elite, isolation might take the form of house arrest banishment to a distant island or provincial estate, with no visitors, no letters, no return. While this might seem merciful by contrast to physical torture, many who lived through it describe the psychological effects as corrosive. Suetonius writes of one senator who, after 5 years on a remote island, returned to the mainland only to beg for execution. He no longer remembered how to speak with confidence, how to sit in public, how to walk without scanning the sky for imagined punishment. There's an unease in these stories because they are not dramatic. There are no gory details to process, no fire or lions to clutch at for moral outrage, only the soft, quiet truth that a human being can be dismantled without touch. That punishment does not always come with force. Sometimes it comes with stillness. Roman law recognized this. The 12 Tables, Rome's earliest legal code, offered clauses on imprisonment, exile, and detention, and later imperial decrees outlined the conditions under which someone might be held indefinitely without sentence. The state gave itself the tools to unperson someone not through spectacle, but through bureaucracy. Paperwork was as effective as rope, if not more. One inscription found in the ruins of a provincial prison reads simply, Oblivionem mandavit. He was entrusted to forgetting. It was not an epitaph. It was a record, scratched into the stone by someone whose name did not survive, whose role was perhaps nothing more than clerk or turnkey. The line is chilling not for what it says, but for how calmly it says it. Forgetting was not an accident, it was an assignment. The Roman worldview was built on visibility on statues, titles, funeral processions, and lineage. To be remembered was to exist. To be named in a will, in a census, on a tomb, this was permanence. And so, to be punished by removal from view was a deeper sentence, one not just of pain, but of negation. You can imagine what it must have felt like, the air turning stale after the second day, the sounds outside growing dimmer as the mind adjusted to the chamber's shape. Perhaps the footsteps of a guard, irregular and indifferent, a tray of food that stopped arriving, a silence so dense it began to feel like weight, and no certainty whether the door would open again. In such a setting, time didn't pass, it pooled. The most horrifying punishment methods used in Rome were not always designed to crush. Sometimes they were designed to hollow, to take a life and leave it technically intact, but spiritually unmoored, slowly dissolving in its own echo. The rooms they used weren't monstrous. They were ordinary, but the emptiness they held had shape, had volume, had pressure. If you've started slipping out of it, keep going. The past barely noticed you were here. To be punished wasn't always to be broken, just to be noticed, again and again, by eyes that wouldn't remember your name. The Romans understood that pain left marks, but shame could follow someone through every corner of their life. Not every punishment in their arsenal bled or burned. Some simply lingered. The punishments of branding, public humiliation, and forced marking were as carefully crafted as any physical torture, designed not to silence a person immediately, but to haunt them indefinitely, to make their identity an open wound in the public eye. Branding in Rome served many purposes. It could indicate slavery, criminality, disloyalty, or in some cases, social contagion, the fear that someone's disobedience might spread like rot if left unnamed. A mark was not just for the condemned to carry, it was for everyone else to recognize. To see the forehead or hand of someone seared with letters like F for fugitivus, a runaway slave, or C for condemned, was to be reminded that law was not always written in ink. Sometimes it was applied with hot iron, in strokes that could not be revised. The physical process of branding was deceptively simple. The iron was heated, often in a communal hearth or brazier, and applied swiftly to the skin. There were no sedatives, no ceremony. Sometimes, the victim was held down. In other cases, particularly for slaves, resistance wasn't even acknowledged. The pain itself was not the point, although it was substantial. What mattered was the result, a visible, enduring message that the bearer had transgressed in a way Rome believed should never be forgotten. And yet, for many, this was not the end of punishment. It was merely its introduction, A branded individual was often still subject to other restrictions, reduced rations, limited movement, or lifelong exclusion from trade and community rituals. The mark didn't close the sentence. It opened it, made every future interaction an extension of the original guilt. It was a reminder that in Roman society, even after punishment was served, memory could still be weaponized. Public humiliation took many forms. Some were theatrical, like the infamia process, where a person's reputation was not only destroyed, but dismantled in public, a reading of offenses, mockery by peers, forced participation in degrading acts. Others were subtler but no less insidious removal of citizenship, stripping of garments, public exposure to scorn. Women might have their hair cut short, a symbol of disgrace. Men might be forced to march barefoot or wear absurd clothing to draw ridicule. The punishment wasn't designed to endanger life, but to deform identity, to change how others looked at you and, eventually, how you looked at yourself. The poet Juvenal once remarked, perhaps too dryly, that Rome had no need for masks, it made faces from consequence. His words capture something vital about these punishments. Their aim was to overwrite the individual's previous self. The citizen became the coward. The merchant became the fraud. The wife became the adulteress. The slave became the warning. These identities stuck, not because of their truth, but because of their visibility. One disturbing practice was the use of enforced posture or display. A person accused of perjury might be made to stand in a public square with a tablet hung from their neck listing their lie, forced to remain there from sunrise to dusk. Passers-by could mock, spit, even strike them, though within limits. The goal was not to incite a riot, but to sustain a spectacle. If the punishment lost its shape too quickly, it lost its power. Rome's justice required pacing, rhythm, and duration, the same qualities that made its architecture durable. Another form of humiliation was ostracization through forced attire. Thieves might be paraded in women's clothing, or adulterers stripped and marched before the temples. These were not spontaneous mobs, but state-sanctioned rituals, codified in local edicts and supported by public expectation. Shame was a communal event. People watched not merely out of curiosity, but because watching was part of the function. It made the lesson whole. Even names were not safe. A person convicted of certain crimes could be legally barred from naming their children after themselves, or stripped of family names entirely. In a world where lineage was everything, to be denied the continuation of one's name was a fate worse than death for many. It was not about the syllables. It was about severing the root. Rome knew how to punish without touch. There is a case recorded by Tacitus veiled in language, as was his habit of a woman accused of conspiracy. Her guilt was unclear, and the court hesitated to execute. Instead, they sentenced her to lifetime public silence, no teaching, no speaking in gatherings, no letters bearing her seal. Her punishment was not a cell, but the dull erosion of her voice. For decades, she lived in the city, visible but unheard, a figure that moved but did not ripple. She became a soft ghost in her own lifetime. Branding and shaming were particularly potent against slaves, who already occupied the lowest rung of Roman hierarchy. A branded slave could never run far, even if they escaped their immediate master. The scar followed. The burn made trust impossible. It carved invisibility into visibility. Some slaves attempted to scar over the brands with other wounds, to blur the mark into something meaningless. Others fled to temples and begged for sanctuary, invoking the gods in hopes of spiritual asylum. The temples offered pause, but rarely permanence. For certain categories of offenders, particularly those convicted of financial fraud or dishonoring the military, their punishment might include the erasure of previously earned honors. This too was a kind of branding, not on skin, but on memory. Medals returned, statues removed, names struck from public records. To rise, fall, and then be unremembered was a uniquely Roman cruelty. applied with the quiet elegance of a chisel, removing a single line from marble. One surviving relief shows a man, with a burned F across his cheek, being dragged by a chain through a market square. His face is passive, not because he feels no shame, but because shame has long since become a mask he knows too well. Children point, vendors glance. No one intervenes. The moment is not dramatic. That's what makes it real. It is a Tuesday morning in a city where punishment is routine, where the sound of sandals on stone means more than any scream. These punishments haunt not because they explode into horror, but because they dissolve into daily life. They remind us that suffering in Rome was not always about death or dismemberment. Sometimes it was about the long echo, the faint glance, the muttered word, the step taken away from you on a crowded street. It was about being known for the wrong reason, forever. The most horrifying punishment methods used in Rome did not always involve steel or fire. Sometimes they used chalk, rope, ash. Sometimes they used words. Shame was not a scar that healed. It was a path you walked long after the sentence had ended. A cloak you could not remove because you no longer remembered what it was like to stand without it. If this held you a little longer than expected, you're not the only one. This is Boring History Nights. They didn't need magic, just wood, rope, metal, and time. If Rome's ideological power lay in its laws and legions, then its physical authority often rested in the tools it used to reinforce obedience devices that required neither brilliance nor complexity, only patience and the willingness to make pain into process. The torturous implements of Rome were not hidden in dark basements or secluded chambers. Many were crafted openly, known by name, referenced in law, even passed down like grim heirlooms of the Republic's dominion. Their purpose was rarely about confession alone. It was about rhythm, the slow application of pressure, force, or stretch until something within a person gave way. The Aquilius, or little horse, was among the most infamous of these devices. Despite the almost innocent name, it was anything but gentle, designed as a kind of wooden frame. It suspended the prisoner's body in a partially seated or extended position, where their limbs could be pulled in opposite directions with increasing tension. The goal was not to tear outright, though that sometimes happened, but to stretch muscles and joints beyond their limits, to exhaust the body's natural geometry. The sensation was not sharp, but grinding, not explosive, but slow. Each creak of the pulley a promise that the next would be worse. The Aquilius was especially associated with interrogation, used in trials for treason, conspiracy, or religious defiance. It was intended to extract names, networks, or motives. However, what it often extracted was something far less useful: pain-induced compliance, confusion, or complete collapse. Roman law permitted the use of torture on slaves and non-citizens as a legal tool of truth-finding. The assumption, always flawed, was that truth rose in proportion to agony, as though honesty could be measured by the depth of a scream. Citizens, in theory, were protected from torture, but as with many Roman rights, the rule bent under the weight of politics or paranoia. During times of crisis or perceived emergency, under emperors like Tiberius or Domitian, even the elite could find themselves beneath the wooden frame, the state whispering that exceptions must be made to preserve order. Rome never tortured recklessly. It tortured with intent, and that was what made it so enduring. Another device, the crux simplex, a variant of the crucifixion pole, was sometimes used not for execution, but as a means of extended suspension. The victim was tied or nailed, arms stretched overhead or behind the back, and left to hang for hours or days, depending on the sentence. This method blurred the line between restraint and torture. It was not meant to kill directly, but to inflame every nerve, to send the body into spasms of fatigue and blood starvation. Occasionally, the posture would cause asphyxiation as the ribcage collapsed inward. Other times, it merely ruined the arms and shoulders permanently. The scorpion, or scutica, was another tool in frequent use, a type of whip constructed with leather thongs embedded with metal tips or small bones. It was not designed to simply lacerate the skin, but to bite with each stroke, carving shallow wounds that bled and burned. In military contexts, this whip was used for discipline, either public punishment or field enforcement. A soldier caught stealing, disobeying orders, or showing cowardice might be lashed dozens of times in front of his cohort. The purpose wasn't just the pain itself, but the music of it, the repetition, the sound of authority landing again and again, each snap marking the body's consent to the empire's rules. What's most chilling is how these devices became normalized. The tools were known, described in manuals, referenced in legal decisions. Executioners trained with them, perfected techniques, handed down variations. The violence wasn't improvised. It was institutional. The pressa, or pressing frame, used weighted slabs of stone to slowly crush the chest or limbs. It could be adjusted with simple mechanics, allowing the torturer to decide whether the pressure should be immediate or incremental. One could be crushed in minutes or hours, depending on the desired effect. The cruelty was not in the materials, they were banal. The cruelty was in the control. Even simpler devices, like thumbscrews or neck irons, were commonly used for confinement or transport. These weren't execution tools, but symbols of limitation, a way to remind a person that movement, breath, or comfort was no longer theirs to choose. Shackles were not only restraints, they were declarations. To wear iron was to announce, silently, that the state had reached inside your skin and found something it would not release. In some prisons, the architecture itself functioned as a form of restraint. Stone benches with built-in rings to bind wrists or ankles. Grooved floors designed to collect blood or urine so that the space could be reused quickly. Walls too low to stand, too short to stretch out. There was no need for elaborate instruments when the room itself had been carved to punish. Rome's genius was not in the invention of pain, but in the systemization of it. Devices were standardized, procedures written down, testimonies collected. The effect was a bureaucracy of suffering, a way to ensure that punishment did not rely on emotion or passion, but on protocol. You did not scream for your sins. You screamed because the manual said you should. Perhaps the most devastating aspect of this machinery was its permanence. Bodies bent on the equilius rarely straightened again. Shoulders dislocated in suspension did not return to normal. Scars from the scutica stayed visible for life. And yet, these were not the worst outcomes. Far more feared was the sentence of the tongue screw, a clamp used to crush or sever the tongue during or before interrogation, particularly in cases involving blasphemy or sedition. The act itself was swift, but its silence lingered. Those who survived were left voiceless, not merely punished, but prevented. Rome understood the symbolic value of the human voice. Silencing it was more than control. It was an obliteration of presence. A man without a tongue could no longer defend, testify, or argue. He became a body without articulation, a figure who remained visible, but inert. One letter from the early 2nd century describes the punishment of a scribe accused of altering a decree. Rather than execution, he was sentenced to hand breakage, each finger methodically dislocated, the metacarpals fractured with a blunt rod. The punishment was surgical in its intent. Rome did not want him dead. It wanted him done. The man who once shaped words would now live among them, unable to participate. A page made of flesh, closed forever. The most horrifying punishment methods used in Rome did not always seek to kill, or even to incapacitate fully. What they often aimed to do was mark to alter, to leave the body in a state where it could still walk, still breathe, still exist in public space, but only as evidence of what had been done. A limping witness, a crooked echo. Rome didn't always erase. Sometimes it preferred to archive. If your breath has disappeared into the dark good, that's where the rest of this belongs. Some never screamed. They were too busy cleaning the blood before the next one arrived. In the silent margins of Rome's punishments stood the ones who were not sentenced, not tried, not named in edicts or accused by witnesses, and yet they were immersed in the rituals of suffering more deeply than almost anyone else. The Roman slaves who maintained the structures of pain, the ones who prepared the whips, fastened the shackles, collected the bodies, and mopped the arena floors were punished in their own way. Though no sentence was ever spoken, they endured not through direct condemnation, but by inhabiting proximity to horror so constant it could no longer be called exceptional. These slaves formed the hidden architecture of Roman justice. They were the executioner's assistants, the cleanup crews of the amphitheater, the attendants in the prison blocks. Some worked the cremation pits, ensuring that the fire consumed the flesh thoroughly, while others were tasked with the disposal of corpses whose families would never claim them. Their labor existed in a shadowed liminality essential, yet invisible, intimate with the dead, yet denied dignity in the work they performed. The lexicon of Roman punishment often omits these figures. Historical documents speak of magistrates, lictors, guards, but rarely of the ones who washed the walls afterward, and yet they were always present. They prepared the equilis and maintained its integrity. They tightened the ropes, heated the irons, swept the platforms before and after each use. It was not just physical labor, it was psychological endurance. To live among screams and be expected to remain calm, to step over collapsed bodies without hesitation, to untangle twisted limbs with the same focus used to fold laundry. There are no surviving autobiographies of these slaves, but faint traces remain, fragments of graffiti scratched behind execution posts, marks in the lower tunnels of the Colosseum, informal sketches drawn in the dust of amphitheater corridors, a handprint left where one should not have lingered, a carved name, a small picture of a bird. These details, fleeting as they are, tell us that some of them wanted to be remembered, or, at the very least, to remind the stone that they were there. The psychological burden of such proximity cannot be overstated. It is difficult enough to suffer pain. It is something altogether different to witness it constantly, especially without the permission to look away. These slaves did not have the luxury of distance or numbness. They had to work within the precise limits of silence. One wrong movement, one look of sympathy or revulsion, and they could become the next victim of the very tools they were meant to manage. Imagine a young slave, perhaps 12 or 13, tasked with holding a bucket of water beside a public whipping. He does not cry, nor speak, nor avert his gaze. His job is not to assist in the punishment, but to follow, to step in, when the executioner needs to wipe the handle of the whip, or when blood thickens in places the audience might find displeasing. He will not be praised. No one will thank him, but he has learned how to move through this space without being seen, and in that invisibility, he survives. In some households, punishment was a private affair, and slaves played both sides, the ones being punished, and the ones administering the punishment on behalf of their masters. A trusted house slave might be ordered to strike another. To refuse was not courage. It was insubordination. Slavery in Rome was not a simple binary of oppressed and oppressor. It was a latticework of hierarchies and roles, many of which forced individuals into impossible moral contortions. Loyalty, in these contexts, was less about affection than about strategic silence. Punishment extended not just to the bodies of the disobedient, but to those too close to disobedience. A slave who failed to report a crime could be flogged. One who delivered food improperly might be chained for a day. The offense was often less important than the mood of the master, or the fear that leniency would be perceived as weakness. And so, a kind of internal rhythm developed, a slow dance of watching, anticipating, submitting. Some slaves became hardened executioners themselves, their lives so saturated by punishment that they came to embody it. These figures were both feared and pitied, despised by the other enslaved for their role, but also understood as caught within the same trap. They did not choose violence. They perfected it because Rome asked them to, and because failing to do so would mean suffering in turn. One text describes such a man: he does not blink when the hammer falls, but he drinks alone, and always in the same cup. Whether that cup was ritual or residue, we cannot know. It was not uncommon for these slaves to be physically marked as instruments of punishment. Branding, as previously mentioned, served as a declaration of ownership and role. Some were tattooed with abbreviations that identified their function: PVA for Public Venator Assistant, or SCV for Service Carnifex Vinculorum, a slave who assisted with chains and bindings. These letters were not badges of honor. They were warnings, visible signs that the bearer lived at the edge of Rome's machinery of death. A haunting truth runs through all of this. The same slave who tied another's wrists in the morning might be executed in the afternoon for a minor infraction. Rome's punishment system did not offer stability. It was not a trade. It was a threshold, a line that moved constantly, that shifted according to whims, weather, and power. To serve in the apparatus of punishment did not guarantee immunity. It only delayed the moment when one might become the punished instead of the punisher. Despite this, some slaves maintained routines. They scrubbed tools, arranged ropes, recorded names, even kept informal ledgers. One preserved wax tablet found in the ruins of a Roman military outpost includes a list of duties for a slave team assigned to a disciplinary barracks. It notes the cleaning of iron shackles, the storage of firewood for branding irons, and the replacement of broken restraints. Each line is followed by a simple checkmark. The work was methodical, not emotional, and perhaps that is what makes their story so devastating. These slaves did not participate in cruelty out of ideology or belief. They served a function. They lived in a system that defined their humanity by usefulness. The tools of punishment passed through their hands like any other trade, except that what they handled was not cloth, or grain, or parchment. It was breath. It was resistance, briefly held and then broken. The most horrifying punishment methods used in Rome did not operate alone. They required preparation, support, maintenance. Behind every executioner stood a network of unseen hands. Behind every sentence passed, someone swept the floor, and behind every scream, someone held a bowl of water, waiting to wash away the evidence before the next one arrived. If any of this echoed even faintly, leave it behind below. Even soft voices weren't spared. Rome's punishments didn't ask for age-only presence. When a crime disrupted the social order, or when loyalty needed to be reaffirmed through fear, it mattered little whether the body receiving punishment was that of a hardened criminal or a child barely old enough to understand the sentence being pronounced. Roman law, while deeply structured, offered surprisingly little insulation for youth when it came to state discipline. The empire did not pretend that innocence was a shield. In fact, sometimes it turned the punishment of children into its most potent display of order, a warning embedded in smaller, quieter bodies. Children could be punished for their own transgressions, but more commonly, they suffered for the crimes or failures of their family. If a father was found guilty of treason or rebellion, his household, including his children, might be punished alongside him. Property seized, names erased, futures revoked. In certain cases, particularly involving political conspiracies, even execution could be ordered, justified under the legal premise that no seed of rebellion should be allowed to grow. The state wasn't merely retaliating, it was gardening by fire. One of the most disturbing examples of this principle comes from the aftermath of the failed Catiline conspiracy. Though the primary conspirators were adults, discussions in the Senate included debates on whether the sons of those involved should be barred from holding future office or, in more extreme interpretations, punished outright. Ultimately, most were spared, but the threat remained. It was not considered outrageous that the sins of the parent might fall like shadow onto the child. To be born into the wrong household could be its own quiet sentence. There are accounts of children paraded through the streets beside their condemned parents, not as witnesses to the punishment, but as symbols of consequence. In these processions, the children were often dressed plainly, their heads shaved, their posture forced into compliance by guards who knew the optics mattered more than the words. The city didn't always need a public spectacle of blood. Sometimes, it needed only the sight of a child watching their world dissolve to remind itself that no one stood beyond the reach of justice. Enslaved children faced an even more precarious reality. While they were technically considered the property of their master, this status offered no real protection from violence or retribution. A slave child who broke an object, repeated a conversation overheard in confidence, or failed to complete a task quickly enough might be whipped, branded, or locked away without recourse. These punishments were rarely documented. They were considered part of the background noise of Roman life, like the clatter of sandals or the barking of dogs. A child's cry was not interruption. It was punctuation. Roman households, especially those of the elite, often employed slave boys as attendants carrying scrolls, preparing baths, running errands between rooms. These children lived under constant scrutiny. Their proximity to power made them vulnerable, and their utility often tethered them to people whose tempers and expectations were inflexible. If a guest was insulted, or a letter misplaced, or a dish dropped during a banquet, punishment followed swiftly, not out of malice, necessarily, but out of rhythm, the daily enforcement of discipline as both a habit and a signal. Some households took pride in appearing merciful, offering rewards and praise for diligence, but such kindness was conditional, and it could evaporate without warning. A visiting senator might disapprove of a child's appearance or accent, prompting an apology from the host and an after-dinner punishment out of sight. Rome was not a society built on kindness. It was built on control, and children, regardless of status, were early participants in that structure. Education, while highly valued among the Roman elite, was also laced with punishment. Boys studying under grammarians or rhetoricians often endured beatings for incorrect recitations, misunderstood grammar, or even minor breaches of classroom etiquette. The rod was part of the curriculum. Students might be forced to kneel for hours, to copy passages repeatedly as physical punishment, or to stand before their peers and be corrected with a slap or a switch. These were not aberrations. They were normalized pedagogical tools, reinforcing that learning was not about self-expression, but obedience. Girls, depending on their class, experienced a different but equally confining structure. While formal education was less common, they were trained in domestic discipline from a young age, how to carry themselves, serve guests, weave properly, and respond with silence when spoken to. Punishment for deviation was often carried out within the home slaps, isolation, denial of food. Some sources suggest that in wealthier families, girls could be subjected to public humiliation if they dishonored their parents being dressed in servants' clothing or paraded before guests as examples of improper femininity. The lines between correction and cruelty were not easily drawn. One case, preserved in a fragmented legal inscription, recounts a trial in which a young girl, approximately 11 years old, was punished for allegedly stealing jewelry from her mistress. Though the court recognized that she may not have understood the value of the item, it upheld her branding as a thief. The logic offered was straightforward: misunderstanding was not immunity. The skin carried the sentence whether the mind comprehended it or not. Sometimes, children were used as witnesses not to testify in court, but to absorb the lesson being offered. A rebellious slave might be flogged in front of their child, a soldier executed before his son was handed his father's helmet. These were not symbolic acts. They were educational. Rome understood that discipline planted early had roots that endured. The punishment of a parent was not complete unless the child carried its image into adulthood. There's a haunting account, paraphrased by Plutarch, of a young boy who had been used as a torchbearer during a public execution. Afterward, he was asked by his instructor to describe what he had seen. The boy hesitated, not because he was afraid to speak, but because, as he explained, "I am still trying to understand whether it was punishment or a play." The line, whether apocryphal or not, captures the disorientation that occurred when punishment became performance, and when children were asked to interpret violence before they had words for it. Despite these realities, Roman culture also idealized the image of the obedient child, modest, disciplined, loyal. Literature and statuary often depicted children as serene, miniature adults, already internalizing the virtues of the state. What was absent from those images, however, were the scars, both physical and invisible, that accompanied such early induction into Rome's harsh moral grammar. Behind every statue of a well-behaved Roman boy stood a dozen who flinched when sandals echoed behind them. And yet, not all children accepted their punishments passively. There are scattered records of boys who resisted, who struck back at masters or ran away from schools, girls who destroyed their looms or spoke out during household rituals. These moments, though rare, remind us that punishment does not always produce compliance. Sometimes it creates defiance. Sometimes it teaches fear. Other times, it simply teaches silence. The most horrifying punishment methods used in Rome were not always designed for grown men. Sometimes, they were small enough to fit within a school bag, a kitchen, or a cradle. The state didn't care how old the offender was. It only cared whether they could be seen. And children, by their nature, were always being watched for promise, for weakness, for signs that they would one day become loyal citizens or dangerous ones. Childhood in Rome was not protected. It was trained, monitored, disciplined, and punished, with tools too large for their hands and expectations far heavier than their size. Truth wasn't required, just a room, just pressure, just someone to say yes. In the Roman world, where justice was both deeply codified and easily manipulated, the line between truth and confession often dissolved the moment someone stepped inside an interrogation chamber. While Rome valued evidence in theory, and its legal systems included procedures and protocols that appear, on the surface, methodical and fair, the reality was far more unstable. Underneath the structure of law, a quieter force persisted, one that relied not on certainty, but on persuasion, coercion, and when those failed, the calculated use of fear. Forced confession was not just a tool of last resort. It was, in many cases, the central pillar of investigation, particularly in cases involving treason, conspiracy, religious deviation, or accusations that touched upon public anxiety. The confession held more value than the crime itself. To confess, especially publicly, was to allow Rome to continue functioning as if its rules still worked, as if justice had been served, not just enforced. The process rarely began with torture. Initially, the accused would be brought before a magistrate or local authority and questioned under oath. But if their answers conflicted with expectations or with the statements of others, suspicion hardened quickly. Slaves and non-citizens could be subjected to physical coercion immediately. Citizens, theoretically protected, could still find themselves cornered by subtler forms of pressure, promises of leniency, threats to family members, manipulation of legal definitions. All of these could be applied long before the lash ever fell. But Rome was nothing if not pragmatic. If threats failed, they escalated. A suspect might be brought into a dim room beneath a basilica or court complex, often made deliberately uncomfortable, not a dungeon in the cinematic sense, but a space stripped of identity. Stone floors, tight corners, the smell of stale sweat and iron. There, they might be kept for hours or days without food, deprived of sleep, made to kneel, to wait, to listen to the echoes of other interrogations occurring just beyond the wall. Eventually, if the authorities deemed it necessary, torture would begin, but not with the intention of sadism. Rome did not torture for pleasure. It tortured to elicit structure. The accused was expected to tell a story. The whip, the press, the pulley, these were not punishments in the immediate sense. They were prompts. A failure to speak meant more pressure. A contradiction invited the blade. To name a name was to slow the blows. To accuse another might mean a moment's pause. The process wasn't wild or improvisational. It was paced, as methodical as any military maneuver. Among slaves, forced confessions were routine. Roman law treated their testimony as invalid unless extracted under duress. The logic was clear, and cold slaves could not be trusted to tell the truth voluntarily, but might do so when tortured. This principle was embedded in law, not a breach of justice, but its intended mechanism. As a result, countless slaves endured agony not for their own crimes, but for those committed by their masters. A whispered accusation, a missing object, a political intrigue, any of these could lead to entire households being interrogated. Some of the condemned would confess not because they were guilty, but because silence no longer served them. There is one surviving case from the early empire involving a noblewoman accused of poisoning her husband. Suspicion fell upon her not due to evidence, but because she had recently rewritten her will. When interrogated, she denied the crime. But her kitchen staff, all slaves, were rounded up and tortured. Within hours, 2 of them confessed to assisting in the poisoning, though later records suggest at least one retracted the confession, and another died during questioning. The noblewoman was sentenced regardless. Her death was quick. The staff, what remained of them, were sold off. The truth was never resolved. It didn't need to be. Even free citizens were not immune, especially during times of political unrest. Under emperors like Caligula or Domitian, suspicion became its own form of evidence. A man could be imprisoned for the way he phrased a toast, or for failing to condemn someone else loudly enough. In these climates, forced confession became a currency. Some gave names preemptively, hoping to shield themselves by redirecting attention. Others, caught off guard, confessed simply to end the questioning, believing that death was preferable to another day of whispered threats and tightening ropes. It's important to recognize the psychological toll of this process. The physical pain, though immense, was often only part of the suffering. The erosion of agency, the forced construction of a narrative, the knowing that your words were not your own created a different kind of injury. To confess falsely under pressure was to participate in your own erasure, to become complicit in a lie designed to make your death easier for others to justify. Rome didn't just want submission, it wanted agreement. The architecture of this process mattered. The rooms were designed to focus the mind inward, low ceilings to instill pressure, rough walls to scrape against the skin, dim light to distort the sense of time. The tools were laid out not dramatically, but as instruments of fact, as though they were part of a script already written, and the accused had simply forgotten their lines. There was no theatrical shouting, no madness, only monotony, a rhythm of questioning, pausing, applying, repeating. Perhaps the most disturbing part is how many confessed just before the torture began, not because they were guilty, but because they believed they would be, no matter what they said. It was not uncommon for an accused person to walk into the chamber already prepared to surrender, understanding that resistance was no longer meaningful. In such cases, the authorities might still proceed with the torture anyway, not out of malice, but to confirm the confession's reliability. Pain had become the signature of truth. Without it, even honesty was suspect. Some Romans saw the danger in this. A few legal scholars argued that forced confession eroded the moral clarity of justice, that it replaced fact with fear. But these voices were often drowned out by the practical needs of state control. In times of stability, procedure was respected. In times of unrest, the confession ruled. It was a cycle Rome never fully escaped. And yet, in some rare cases, silence held. There were individuals who endured hours of torture without yielding a name, a phrase, a single nod. These figures were not always honored. Often, they vanished into unmarked graves. But within certain circles, especially among early Christian communities and dissident sects, these people became legends. Their refusal to speak was not just defiance, it was purity, a final act of ownership over their own story. One account tells of a young man accused of aiding a fugitive philosopher. Though beaten and broken, he refused to name his friend. When asked why, he reportedly said, "You already have the answers you want. Why should I speak the ones I have?" The guard noted this with a kind of grudging respect, but the sentence proceeded. The young man did not survive. His friend, who had already fled the city, never returned. The most horrifying punishment methods used in Rome did not always scar the body. Sometimes, they worked on the voice. They reached inside a person and rewrote their ending. Forced confession did not end pain. It began a performance in which the condemned played both villain and victim, and once the lines were spoken, the play could close, the audience could rest, and the city could breathe again, convinced, for another day, that the system still worked. You don't have to carry this. Most of it didn't want to be remembered anyway. When the divine got offended, punishment came dressed in ritual and ended in acts that resembled ceremony but felt unmistakably like cruelty. Religion in Rome was not a matter of personal faith or quiet introspection. It was public, performative, and tightly bound to state power. To commit sacrilege or offend the gods was not just a theological misstep, it was a civic crime, and the punishments, though cloaked in religious justification, often carried all the severity and theatrical precision of a legal sentence. Rome did not treat blasphemy as mere offense. It treated it as disruption, a fracture in the moral fabric that held empire and divinity in tension. Many of these punishments existed at the intersection of public ritual and controlled violence. The gods, after all, were seen not as distant overseers, but as active participants in Roman life entities, who required appeasement and reacted with force when slighted. To violate a temple, to misuse a sacred object, to speak ill of a Vestal Virgin, or defile a statue, could result in responses that were as elaborate as they were irreversible. The punishment was often framed not as vengeance, but as purification. What Rome could not tolerate, it removed in a way that suggested restoration. The most striking example of this mindset lies in the fate of the Vestal Virgins, who broke their vow of chastity. These women, chosen in childhood, swore to serve the goddess Vesta for 30 years, maintaining the sacred fire and symbolizing the city's unbroken integrity. If one of them was found to have broken her vow through consensual relations or coercion, it rarely mattered. The penalty was live burial, not because Roman law allowed it in ordinary cases, but because no blood could be shed in executing a Vestal. To harm one directly was to violate the purity she embodied, and so, the sentence was engineered to both obey and offend. She was lowered into a small, subterranean chamber, provided with a single lamp and a few days' worth of food, and sealed beneath the earth. The act was framed as exile, not execution, even though everyone understood the outcome. The male partner, if identified, was usually beaten to death in public, a reminder that impiety was not just personal but contaminating. These events were rare, but their rarity only enhanced their symbolic potency. When they occurred, they drew crowds, because they spoke to a fear older than law that the gods might abandon Rome if purity was not maintained. Other religious punishments were less secretive, but no less severe. Individuals accused of impiety, heresy, particularly in later imperial periods, or interference with state rituals, could be stripped of citizenship, denied burial, or executed by fire or drowning, not because the state lacked options, but because the offense demanded visibility. Some criminals were burned at the edges of temples they had defiled, their ashes buried under stones etched with curses to prevent their spirits from returning. In other instances, victims were lashed while tied to altars not sacrificed, but placed within the ritual space to emphasize the severity of their error. They became warnings wrapped in ceremony. There is a documented account from the time of Tiberius of a man who laughed during a public sacrifice. No crime had been formally committed, but the priest took offense, and an inquiry was ordered. The man was later found guilty of impiety, sentenced not to death, but to be paraded nude through the city, marked with soot, and forced to carry a piglet, a traditional offering to the Capitoline. There, he was required to make a public apology to the gods before being lashed and banished. The penalty was not harsh by Roman standards, but the message was unmistakable. Religion in Rome was not optional, and irreverence could be prosecuted. What makes these punishments especially chilling is their dual nature. They were, at least on the surface, acts of devotion. Priests performed them. Sacred words were spoken. Offerings were made. But beneath the incense and the hymns, a very human machinery was at work, one that used belief as a framework for pain. To be punished religiously in Rome was to be transformed into a kind of object lesson. Your suffering was not just about your failure. It was about restoring balance between the mortal and divine. One scholar wrote that Roman religious punishment operated on the assumption that the gods kept ledgers. If this was true, then the state became their accountant, tallying sins, assigning cost, collecting payment. In practice, the victims of these punishments were often marginalized already foreigners, cultists, those who worshipped in unfamiliar ways. During the periodic purges of so-called Eastern religions, adherents of Isis or Mithras were sometimes punished publicly for refusing to participate in Roman rites. Their temples were destroyed, their idols broken. Some practitioners were whipped or enslaved, others were executed for defiance. These acts were framed as preservation, not persecution. Rome prided itself on religious tolerance, so long as that tolerance did not interfere with civic rituals. Once it did, belief became offense, and offense demanded spectacle. Even in death, religious punishment could continue. Those who violated sacred space might be denied burial altogether, a fate the Romans considered horrific, since proper burial was tied to the soul's peace in the afterlife. To rot above ground, uncremated, unmourned, was to be punished not only in life, but in whatever came after. In a culture that built elaborate tombs for its beloved dead, to be refused one was the most eloquent silence imaginable. Sometimes, animals were included in the punishment. Pigs, goats, or birds might be sacrificed alongside the condemned, meant to symbolically absorb the impurity of the offender. This added a layer of unsettling ritualism. The human and the animal became part of the same performance, a conflation of body, spirit, and failure. Blood was poured, prayers recited, and the crowd, though perhaps unsure of every theological nuance, understood that something unclean had been removed. And yet, despite all of this, or perhaps because of it, these punishments left deep shadows in Roman memory. They were not spoken of often in casual writing. They appear in formal histories, legal commentaries, religious treatises, but rarely in personal letters. Perhaps because they unsettled the very citizens who accepted them. Perhaps because, for all Rome's pride in law and reason, there was something about sacred violence that made even the powerful uneasy. What makes these punishments horrifying is not just their pain, but their aesthetic, their cold, ritualized precision. The way a sentence could be passed in sacred language, carried out with sacrificial implements, and concluded with offerings and prayers. It wasn't death by chaos. It was death by choreography, a punishment that made cruelty look like worship. The most horrifying punishment methods used in Rome did not always come with rage or hatred. Sometimes, they came in robes. They came with incense. They came with the voice of a priest intoning forgiveness, while the earth was still being shoveled over a woman buried alive. That contradiction between what was said and what was done is where the true terror lived. If none of this is making sense anymore, you're exactly where you should be. If she could speak across time, perhaps she would whisper, "They called me impure. I called it survival." In the hollow spaces of Roman punishment, there occasionally emerges a voice not entirely erased, a presence soft enough to be overlooked by history's louder judgments, but still there echoing beneath the stone, woven into the routines of cruelty and control. She may not have had a name the records preserved, nor a monument raised in her memory, but in the margins of law and punishment, women left behind fragments faint, slow, almost translucent of lives that were punished not only for actions, but for existence itself. In Rome, gender was not merely a social category, but a legal architecture. It determined one's freedoms, one's risks, and most crucially, the kinds of punishment one could receive. Women were not subject to exactly the same system of laws as men, nor were they exempt from violence. Instead, they occupied a peculiar middle ground, protected in theory, but in practice, deeply vulnerable. The punishments Roman women endured were often rooted not in overt transgressions, but in violations of expectation of behavior, appearance, silence, chastity, submission. A wife who defied her husband's authority, a daughter who resisted an arranged marriage, a widow who refused to remarry when expected. These were not legal crimes in the narrowest sense, but they represented breaches in the Roman understanding of order. And so, families handled them with the tools Rome gave them: expulsion from the household, forced confinement, corporal punishment, and, in rare but not isolated cases, death under the guise of honor. One of the most revealing practices was the right of paterfamilias, the legal authority held by the male head of household, which included the power to punish and even kill members of his family under specific conditions. While in later imperial periods, this authority was curbed somewhat by legal reforms, during the Republic and the early Empire, it allowed for acts of domestic punishment so severe that they blurred the line between household discipline and execution. A father could order his daughter whipped, exiled, disowned, and if she was found guilty of adultery or disgrace, she might be killed without judicial review. These acts were rarely public. They didn't require courts or clerks or public postings. They happened behind closed doors, within the soft stone walls of villas, beneath the gaze of ancestors carved in marble, and because they were private, they were often unrecorded except when the violence spilled beyond the expected bounds, or when gossip made a tragedy impossible to ignore. There is a story, half remembered by Tacitus, of a young noblewoman who refused to marry the man her father had chosen. She fell in love instead with a poet, a man far below her station, whose verses were reportedly too free with the truth. The affair, discreet at first, became difficult to hide. When confronted, she refused to repent. The father ordered her locked in her room without food. For 2 days she endured. On the third, she wrote a poem of farewell on the wall using her own blood and was found unconscious by a servant. Whether she lived or not, Tacitus does not say. The poem, predictably, was destroyed. Women accused of poisoning were particularly vulnerable to theatrical punishment. Poisoning was seen not only as a crime, but as a betrayal of the domestic role, the wife or servant who turned nurture into murder. Those found guilty might be burned alive, even in periods when fire was otherwise disfavored as an execution method. In some cases, they were paraded with signs hung around their necks, denouncing them as traitors to their households. The phrase unfaithful to the hearth appears repeatedly in surviving edicts, a condemnation that equated personal betrayal with sacrilege. Slaves, especially women, endured punishments that combined cruelty with humiliation. A female slave who was suspected of theft or defiance might be stripped, flogged in public, and then branded not merely to punish, but to shame. Some were forced to wear iron collars inscribed with phrases like, "Hold me, I've fled before," or "I belong to the baker at the temple of Mars." These collars weren't merely restraints. They were portable judgments, looping condemnation into every movement, every glance from a stranger. Sexual violence, too, was often a tool of punishment, though rarely described as such in Roman sources. When a female slave was punished for seduction, adultery, or even disobedience, the consequences often included rape, framed not as a crime, but as a consequence of her failure to maintain her place. For free women, accusations of infidelity could lead to exposure, being forced to stand nude in a public space, not as spectacle alone, but as purification. Shame and correction were fused into a single ritual. What made these punishments especially haunting was the narrative imposed upon them. Women were not simply punished. They were rewritten. Their pain became a story of impurity, of disloyalty, of deviance. Their silence was recast as guilt, their resistance as madness. And because most Roman histories were written by men, the women who suffered rarely retained the right to their own versions. They faded not only from law, but from memory. Yet some traces remain, hidden in legal commentary and rhetorical exercises. One surviving debate exercise given to students includes the case of a woman who murdered her abusive husband and fled. The students were asked to argue whether she deserved punishment. In some copies of the manuscript, a marginal note appears, almost certainly from a later reader, stating, "If she had not killed him, she would not have lived." It is not a defense. It is a quiet recognition of something too complex for the legal formula. The most horrifying punishment methods used in Rome were not always rendered with steel or fire. Sometimes they were handed down in expectation the silence demanded, the obedience assumed, the life already scripted. Women who stepped outside those lines found themselves punished not just by law, but by absence, their names removed from records, their images defaced, their stories rewritten or erased entirely. They did not burn in the forum or hang from the gates. They simply stopped appearing. And yet, in small ways, they remain. In the scratched lines of graffiti on villa walls, signed by a woman named Livia, who warned, "Don't marry the man with dry eyes." In a single earring buried in the cellars of the Mamertine prison, too fine to have belonged to a slave, too old to still be worn by the time it was found. In the anonymous notes of scribes who copied legal texts and paused, sometimes, to question them in quiet Latin scrawl. If you listen carefully, the voices are still there, low, steady, worn thin by the centuries. They may not name themselves, but they ask not to be forgotten. What if forgetting was never failure, just a softer way to hold weight? Not even senators were spared, but their deaths came wrapped in poetry, not pity. While the lower classes and enslaved populations bore the brunt of Rome's most visible punishments, the political elite had their own theater of discipline, one where the instruments were not always made of iron, but of language, expectation, and meticulously calculated humiliation. Rome did not need to brutalize the powerful with the same methods it used on the poor. It knew how to dismantle them with subtler tools: exile, forced suicide, property seizure, and public condemnation that burned more slowly but no less completely. In many ways, the punishment of Rome's elite functioned as both spectacle and strategy. It allowed emperors and magistrates to reaffirm control without appearing tyrannical, and it reinforced the notion that even the highest ranks were accountable not to the people, but to the invisible hand of state order. The execution of senators, generals, and former consuls was rarely carried out with raw violence in the open streets. Instead, these men were offered the illusion of dignity. They were invited to take their own lives, often in their homes, surrounded by their family and slaves, with a scribe on hand to document the final moments. This wasn't leniency. It was choreography, the transformation of punishment into tragic narrative. The precedent was long-standing. Even during the Republic, political figures who fell out of favor were often accused of treason or corruption, and then pressed to commit suicide rather than endure a public trial. Cicero, whose eloquence once shaped the very rhetoric of justice, met his end not in court, but at the edge of a beach, betrayed and beheaded after a political reversal. His hands, the tools of his persuasive legacy, were nailed to the speaker's platform as a final commentary on the power of words. In Rome, even death had footnotes. By the imperial era, this tradition evolved further. Under emperors like Nero, Tiberius, and Domitian, accusations of maestas, offenses against the dignity of the emperor, became a powerful and often ambiguous legal weapon. One could be accused for a comment, a gesture, or even an absence of expected loyalty. Once targeted, a senator might be summoned not to court, but to a private audience where the verdict was already known. There, he would be told that the emperor had lost confidence, a phrase that might sound mild, but carried the weight of death. If he acted with honor, he would take poison or open his veins. If he resisted, arrest or more degrading punishment awaited. The case of Seneca, the philosopher and tutor to Nero, is among the most remembered. Accused of conspiracy, he was ordered to end his life. What followed was not a private withdrawal, but a carefully observed process. He bathed, dressed, and cut his veins while conversing with his friends, maintaining the stoicism he had spent his life preaching. When blood flow proved slow, he took poison, which also failed. Finally, he was placed in a hot bath to speed the process. His death became both a punishment and a lesson, one that Rome admired as much for its composure as for its compliance. These suicides served several functions. First, they preserved a modicum of dignity for the condemned, which Rome still considered important, even when ending a life. Second, they protected the state from the complications of a formal trial, the risk of public sympathy, political debate, or even outright resistance. Finally, they allowed the property of the accused to be partially preserved for heirs, especially if the suicide was timely and without resistance. To refuse the invitation often meant the total confiscation of wealth, the exile of family members, and the erasure of the name from records and statues. In this way, the threat of disgrace extended beyond the individual, casting a shadow over descendants and allies. The punishment of the powerful was as much about memory as it was about action. To have one's statue removed, one's name struck from inscriptions, one's image blurred from coins, these were sentences of a different order. Damnatio memoriae was not merely the destruction of a life, but the deliberate removal of its trace. A senator executed for disloyalty might endure not just death, but historical erasure. His family would be barred from mentioning his achievements. His face would be chipped away by stonecutters. His legacy would be replaced by silence. This erasure was not always complete. In fact, some of the most enduring figures in Roman history, like Sejanus, the ambitious prefect under Tiberius, exist primarily because of the records detailing their downfall. The Senate's decrees, the graffiti scribbled in disgust, the satirical poems shared among commoners, all preserved the punishment, even as the state tried to dissolve the person. In Rome, obliteration became a paradox. The more dramatically someone was erased, the more likely some piece of their story would remain. Still, not every elite punishment ended in death or oblivion. Some men were exiled, forced to leave Rome and reside on remote islands or in distant provinces, cut off from their influence and alliances. The poet Ovid famously exiled to Tomis, on the Black Sea, never received a formal explanation. He referred to his offense as carmen et error, a poem and a mistake. His verses from exile reflect a mind unmoored, navigating loneliness, shame, and a city's rejection that felt as permanent as a wound. He never returned. Exile, though less violent than execution, carried its own weight. It was not just geographical removal, but social unmaking. A senator in exile lost his voice in the forum, his seat in the Senate, his right to influence Roman law or policy. He became a ghost in the empire, living but unheard. In some cases, letters from the exiled were intercepted or destroyed. Rome understood that silence was more dangerous when it came from those who once shaped the public voice. In rare cases, a condemned man might resist. He might flee, hide, or even take up arms, but these responses were usually brief and ended poorly. The machinery of Rome was too vast, too methodical. Even in failure, the system absorbed dissent and repurposed it as evidence of necessity. A failed rebellion by a nobleman only reinforced the righteousness of his punishment. His execution became not a stain, but a justification. What remains remarkable is how thoroughly these elite punishments were integrated into Roman public life. They were discussed in letters, depicted in mosaics, even commemorated in tragedies and comedies. The fall of a powerful man was not a private embarrassment. It was a civic event, a reminder that the structure held, that the rules still applied, even to those who once seemed untouchable. That Rome, for all its contradictions, did not pretend the powerful were immune. It simply reminded them, gently and then brutally, that power came on loan. The most horrifying punishment methods used in Rome did not always involve chains or crosses. Sometimes, they came with a letter sealed in wax. Sometimes, with a quiet conversation behind closed doors. Sometimes, with a line in the Senate records that began with honor and ended with silence. These punishments did not just remove men, they rearranged memory. And perhaps that is the true horror, that a life could be rewritten not in blood, but in ink. That an empire so obsessed with legacy could turn it off with a single decree. That the ones who had built the machine might one day find themselves crushed beneath it, not loudly, but with extraordinary poise. Sometimes, it wasn't the condemned who broke, but everyone they loved who faded hollow around them. In a system as pervasive and all-consuming as Rome's, punishment rarely stopped at the individual. More often than not, it extended like slow-moving fire across families, households, and even entire communities, singeing not only those who stood accused, but all those who happened to stand near. Guilt could be contagious, if not by law, then by perception, and the consequences, social, economic, emotional, often outlasted the punishment itself. In Roman legal doctrine, the idea of infamia, the loss of social and legal standing, was one way this spillover effect manifested. A man sentenced for certain crimes, particularly moral or political offenses, might be formally marked as infames, but this degradation did not occur in a vacuum. His sons could be barred from holding office, his wife from appearing in court as a reliable witness, his household from being invited to public events or religious ceremonies. Entire generations could find themselves stained by association, their names carrying a kind of whispered weight wherever they went. This was especially true in cases involving treason or conspiracy. Under laws like lex majestatis, which governed offenses against the state or emperor, punishment often included not only execution or exile, but property seizure. The estates of the condemned were confiscated, their homes shuttered, their possessions catalogued and redistributed or sold. Children were left without inheritance, widows were rendered penniless, siblings were suddenly suspect. Guilt became a fog not thick enough to be named, but persistent enough that it lingered in the spaces where sympathy once lived. One widow of a senator executed for plotting against Tiberius wrote in a surviving letter that she had to sell her jewelry to pay for her son's schooling. Her husband's friends had vanished. The family villa had been seized. Her name, though unchanged, had become a kind of whisper repeated in forums and baths, never to her face, but always loud enough for her to feel. She described walking through the market and noticing that even the fruit sellers looked away. "It is not that they hate me," she wrote. "It is that they fear I still carry him on my breath." The children of the condemned often carried the heaviest burdens. Though rarely punished directly by the state, at least in principle, they became quiet targets for exclusion. Teachers might refuse to take them on. Marriage prospects disappeared. Friends' parents withdrew permission to visit. These children, especially boys, grew up knowing they would not be able to compete for office, enter the priesthood, or rise through the military not because of what they had done, but because their name now served as a reminder of Rome's disapproval. Some changed their names, petitioning to be adopted into other families, seeking the protection of patrons or distant relatives. The process was arduous and often unsuccessful. More commonly, they lived in the long pause, after a sentence not dead, not condemned, but paused, as if the empire itself had forgotten what to do with them. Their lives were spent attempting to unwrite what Rome had already decided. Even among the enslaved, the ripple effect was severe. A slave whose master was executed could be punished not for complicity, but for proximity. Many were flogged during interrogations, forced to give false confessions, or sold off afterward to prevent them from maintaining ties to the disgraced household. Those who survived the initial fallout often found themselves placed in homes where they were treated with suspicion, marked as spoiled or tainted, watched more closely, trusted less. Their histories followed them not on paper, but in the hesitation of their new owners, in the way commands were given a little more sharply, punishments dealt a little more quickly. Friends and associates of the punished were often subjected to a softer but still corrosive form of retaliation. They might be removed from invitations to Senate meetings or temple rituals, reassigned to distant provinces, or passed over for promotions. In private correspondence, particularly among the upper classes, one finds careful phrases, the deliberate distancing of language. A man once described as brother in arms becomes merely a former colleague. Another, once praised as a steward of justice, is reduced to one who chose differently. The political instinct to protect oneself from contamination shaped how people remembered, or chose not to remember, those who had fallen. This practice of reputational quarantine was not formalized, yet it operated with the efficiency of law, and it wasn't always cruel in intent. Sometimes it was simply survival. In a city where favor and disfavor could shift with a single rumor, knowing when to walk away from a friend was considered prudence, not betrayal. Loyalty was a virtue, but it had its limits. Those who clung too tightly to the condemned risked joining them in exile, disgrace, or worse. There are also cases in which entire communities suffered because of a single individual's actions. If a provincial governor was found guilty of corruption or rebellion, his town might lose tax privileges, be barred from holding certain festivals, or even suffer the destruction of its walls as symbolic punishment. Rome did not always need to shed blood to assert its control. Sometimes, it simply withdrew its recognition, and in a world built on status, that absence could feel like starvation. In the Jewish and Christian communities of the later empire, this dynamic took on yet another shape. When one member of a congregation was executed for defying Roman religious expectations, others were watched more closely. Families of martyrs were sometimes harassed, denied burial rites, or forced to recant publicly. The execution of one could become the interrogation of many. In this way, punishment served not only as retribution, but as a seed from which broader surveillance could grow. Rome understood that fear travels faster when it moves through love. To punish a man was to silence him. To punish everyone around him was to ensure that silence multiplied. This was the empire's most refined cruelty, not the sword or the flame, but the long, slow ache of absence, the empty chairs at dinners, the questions no one answered, the friends who changed the subject whenever his name came up. And yet, in spite of this, or perhaps because of it, those left behind often became quiet preservers of memory. Widows maintained altars to husbands declared traitors. Children taught to forget still whispered their fathers' names before sleep. Even servants carried stories from house to house, reshaping legacy in small, defiant phrases. There are examples of graffiti scratched in alleyways long after executions. He was honest. They lied. He fed the hungry. These were not legal appeals. They were fragments of counter-narrative, fragile as breath. The most horrifying punishment methods used in Rome did not always leave bruises. Sometimes, they left behind spaces where a man used to sit in the Senate, where a family once walked together, where a name used to be carved in stone. These absences didn't shout. They waited. And in waiting, they reminded everyone who saw them that punishment was never just personal. It was inherited. It was communal. It was a quiet undoing, distributed across time. That cracked cup from earlier, you still cradle it not for what it held, but for who touched it last. Thousands watched, still as statues, soft with wine and cruelty, and no one left unchanged. The Roman crowd was not just a passive observer of punishment, it was often its reason. In a culture where justice functioned as theater and brutality could become a civic ritual, the audience wasn't a backdrop. It was the arena. It was the echo. It was the hollow applause beneath the executioner's swing. From the early Republic through the late Empire, public punishment served not only to deter crime, but to shape identity. Roman identity, after all, was built on participation in politics, in war, in spectacle. Just as a citizen might vote in the Forum or cheer for a charioteer in the Circus Maximus, he also took his place in the crowd that watched a slave torn apart by animals, or a traitor beaten until his skin fell away from bone. This wasn't incidental. It was design. The Republic needed more than laws to hold itself together. It needed myths, and punishment, when performed correctly, became a myth in the making. The Colosseum, Rome's most enduring monument to spectacle, is perhaps the clearest expression of this principle. Though best remembered today for gladiatorial combat, it also served as a stage for executions, often held at midday between matches. These interludes, called Damnatio ad Bestias, or condemnation to the beasts, were designed for maximal visual effect. The condemned were dressed in costumes, placed in elaborately decorated settings that mimicked mythological stories, and then left to die in front of thousands. Lions, leopards, bears, and even crocodiles were unleashed not simply as instruments of death, but as narrative participants. A man convicted of hubris might be cast as Icarus, strapped to wings and catapulted into the arena, only to crash. A woman accused of adultery might be made to play Pasiphae, placed inside a mock wooden cow while a bull was released. These weren't just killings. They were transformations, bodies into symbols, death into entertainment. The crowd, fed and flushed with sunlight, watched without flinching. Children clapped. Senators made polite conversation, and the condemned, surrounded by sand that never forgot a stain, became stories told at dinner. And yet, even in this theater of cruelty, not everyone was immune to doubt. Writers like Seneca and Juvenal questioned the effect these spectacles had on Roman morals. Were these punishments justice or appetite? Was the crowd being instructed or corrupted? The answer, perhaps, lay somewhere in between. Rome did not distinguish clearly between horror and awe. To witness suffering was to be reminded of order. To turn away from it was to risk the suspicion that you didn't belong. There were also moments of reversal, when the crowd, in a flicker of empathy or defiance, disrupted the sentence. In 24 BCE, during a festival in the Forum, a man accused of theft was publicly beaten and prepared for crucifixion. But the crowd, having heard his pleas and moved by his youth, began to shout for mercy. The magistrate, taken aback, paused. The shouting swelled. Finally, the sentence was delayed, and later commuted. The man was spared, not by law, but by the people, a rare moment when the audience became something more than passive witness. Yet such moments were exceptional. More often, silence held. What is more difficult to grasp, from the distance of 2 millennia, is the emotional texture of these crowds. Were they truly cruel, or merely conditioned? Did they cheer out of sadism, or submission to ritual? Ancient texts give conflicting answers. Some speak of weeping mothers in the stands, covering their children's eyes as the axe fell. Others tell of raucous laughter, bets placed on how long a man would take to die, or applause when a condemned thief made a final witty remark before being burned. It is likely that both are true. Rome was large enough to contain contradiction. A man might cry at the death of a friend and still enjoy the execution of a stranger. A woman might mourn her son and then attend a spectacle that mimicked his fate. Cruelty and grief were not opposites in this world. They were neighbors, sometimes whispering to each other, sometimes pretending not to notice. Even private punishments, floggings in the villa courtyard, scourgings on military marches, strangulations in quiet prison cells were not entirely unseen. They existed in the minds of others, described later in hushed tones, or inferred from missing faces. One did not need to witness a punishment directly to feel its presence. It echoed in the way slaves walked more carefully the next day, in the way a family at the market avoided looking at the magistrate's home, in the way a child stopped asking what happened to her uncle. Some punishments left visible marks: a branded forehead, a cropped ear, a chain around the ankle. These were walking reminders, symbols carried not by the state, but by the punished themselves. The crowd saw them not just during sentencing, but in daily life. And each time, the message was renewed: the law remembers. The empire watches. Your pain has a purpose. But did it? Or was it simply ritual, repeated until it felt like meaning? Historians still debate whether these spectacles truly reduced crime or merely satisfied public hunger. Some argue that executions had deterrent value, especially when performed in public spaces. Others suggest the opposite, that repeated exposure to violence numbed the populace, making empathy more difficult, cruelty more banal. The truth may be more complex. Perhaps punishment in Rome was never about reform or deterrence. Perhaps it was about reminding everyone, especially those without power, what their place was. Not all laws were written on scrolls. Some were written in sand, in blood, in breath. You wonder if memory was ever about truth or just arrangement. If the quiet held you longer than you meant, just say so. Even now, the body stops, but the punishment drips through time, faint and slow, like a whisper that forgets how to end. What Rome created was not simply a set of disciplinary tools, nor a catalog of state-sanctioned horrors, but a cultural architecture where pain was currency, silence was policy, and suffering, if shaped correctly, could be inherited across generations. Long after the last execution in the Forum, the rhythms of its punishments remain in the language, in the echoes of law, and in the way the world continues to draw lines between who deserves mercy and who must endure spectacle. Even now, the Roman model of punishment haunts modern systems through architecture, terminology, and legal precedent. The amphitheater may no longer host lions, but the idea that justice must be seen, must perform itself for the satisfaction of an audience, survives in courtrooms and prison yards. The phrase Roman justice still circulates, sometimes uttered admiringly, as if cruelty wrapped in discipline is an ideal rather than a caution. And yet, if one listens closely, the traces are not only institutional, they're emotional. They live in the quiet expectation that pain must justify itself to power, that those who suffer must prove their innocence not once, but endlessly. In this way, the most horrifying punishment methods used in Rome have endured not because they were efficient, but because they were unforgettable. Their cruelty was not hidden. It was named, engraved, celebrated, and paradoxically preserved. But history is not a ledger of events. It is a practice of memory, of choosing what to carry and what to leave buried. Rome chose to carry its punishments. It built monuments to them. It inscribed them on triumphal arches. It staged them in the daylight. And as the centuries unfolded, those methods became rituals, and the rituals became heritage. Still, not every punishment was successful. Some backfired. Some created martyrs. Some turned sympathy into resistance. Spartacus, after all, was born from a punishment, a gladiator made of iron and refusal. His rebellion, though crushed, echoed in every chained hand that wondered if perhaps the empire could bleed. Others vanished completely, their names lost, their punishments unrecorded, not because they mattered less, but because memory, too, has its politics. A slave woman flogged to death for breaking a vase might not appear in the annals of Tacitus, but her scream, or the absence of it, lived on in the gaze of the next servant who dried the same dish, wondering how soft a hand must be to survive. Punishment, in Rome, was never just about correction. It was about choreography, the placement of the body, the silence of the bystanders, the role of the magistrate. Even the wind mattered, the executioner's robe, the hour of the day, all had their place. A crucifixion at dawn sent a different message than one at dusk. A decimation at the front of the line hit harder than one behind the hill. And what of those who administered the pain? Were they immune to its residue? Roman sources rarely speak of their inner lives. But one wonders, did the man who drove nails into a thief's hands dream of his own son? Did the guard who strangled a senator glance away when his daughter asked why his hands were red? The answer, of course, is unknowable, but necessary to ask. Because every punishment carries two shadows, one that falls on the punished, and one that trails the punisher. Perhaps that is what Rome never fully reckoned with, that violence never stops where you aim it. It echoes, it rebounds, it reshapes the shape of fear. It sharpens the whisper that tells you, do not speak, do not move, do not forget. But forgetting is not the same as healing. Rome, in all its marble glory, could not escape what it had done. The same stones that paved its triumphal processions were washed in the runoff of executions. The same columns that held its temples stood near scaffolds, and the same city that raised laws also raised ropes. You've come far enough for one night. Let the quiet carry you now, and if sleep hasn't come yet, maybe this softened the weight. This was Boring History Nights. Until next time, sleep softly. You don't need to carry any more of this. Let the room be what it is, quiet, still, unchanging. Let the edges of the story blur the way breath fogs a mirror. Nothing more is asked of you. Not tonight. Maybe your thoughts are still pacing. Maybe they've folded themselves quietly, like linen pressed flat and stacked away. Either way is fine. The important part is that you're here, in this slow place between memory and silence. The air doesn't move. Somewhere, a chair creaks, or maybe it's just your breath brushing the quiet. Dust lingers mid-fall, as if history paused. You've wandered with emperors and strangers, with names written in laws, and others lost in dirt. You've heard about punishments so cruel they reshape time, but even those have passed. All of them. Now, let them go. You're not in the forum. You're not in a cell. You're in a room that doesn't ask anything from you. Not justice, not understanding, just rest. And if something stayed with you, a phrase, a silence, a face that never had a name, let it settle like ash and not fire. You don't need to solve it. Just hold it gently until it doesn't ask for your hands anymore. If something here softened the edge of your night, tell me. Whisper a thought below. I'll hear it, even if it's faint. This is Boring History Nights, and we wait for quiet the way others wait for answers. You've heard enough for now. Let the story finish itself without you. And if you're still awake, maybe the silence felt less alone this time. This was Boring History Nights. Until next time, drift softly and stay.